Before the island took everything, my name was Kama, and I was only the quiet operator behind Ren, the survival star who smiled for cameras he never truly trusted. The first wave did not scare me. The second one did. It hit the yacht from the side and made the whole deck tilt like a table with one broken leg. Rain cut across my face in hard lines. Salt water filled my mouth. I held the waterproof camera case against my ribs and grabbed the rail with my other hand. Ren was still shouting at the storm like the weather was part of his show. His hair was soaked, his jacket was torn, and he still tried to look heroic. He pointed at the black sky and yelled that this was the most dangerous survival episode ever filmed. The problem was that none of the cameras were recording. The main rig had died 20 minutes earlier. The backup lens was full of water. The satellite transmitter went silent after the first mast cable snapped. Ren knew that. Ari knew that. I knew that. But Ren kept performing because performance was the only skill he trusted when reality stopped obeying him. Another wave slammed into the yacht. The hull screamed below us. That sound was not dramatic. It was not cinematic. It was structural failure. I looked toward the engine hatch. Water pushed through the seam around the lower panel. The compartment was taking in more than it could drain. I shouted that the hull was flooding too fast. Ren turned toward me with pure irritation, as if my warning had ruined his best line. He told me to stop shaking and keep the lens steady. I told him the lens was dead and the yacht was losing buoyancy by the minute. His face changed for half a second. Not fear, calculation. He looked at the emergency raft, then at the supply crates lashed near the rail. Ari stood beside the broken mast with her arms wrapped around a red waterproof bag. Her eyes moved between us, waiting for Ren to become his own legend. He did not become a hero. He became efficient in the ugliest way. He shoved past me and cut the rope holding the nearest supply crate. The crate dropped into the raft with a heavy splash of plastic and metal. I grabbed his arm and told him the raft could hold 3 people. He looked at my hand like it was dirt on his sleeve. Then he said the raft could hold useful people, not dead weight with a camera. Ari whispered his name. He did not look at her. He ordered her into the raft and told her to keep the emergency bag above the water. I stepped toward the rope ladder hanging over the side. My boots slipped on the wet deck, but I caught the rail and pulled myself forward. Ren stepped between me and the raft. His smile was gone now. Without the cameras, there was nothing charming left on his face. He said I was an operator, not a survivor. He said people like me were useful only when someone stronger had already made the plan. I looked at Ari. She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her fingers tightened around the red bag, and the storm gave her silence an excuse. The yacht dropped into the trough between 2 waves. The raft slammed against the hull. I reached for the ladder again, and Ren pushed me. My shoulder hit the rail. Pain flashed down my side. I almost lost the case, but my fingers locked around the handle before it slid away. Ren grabbed the case from the deck and threw it at my chest. It hit hard enough to knock the air from my lungs and make my vision flash white. He shouted that I could film my last report. Then he kicked the raft away from the yacht with his boot and cut the final rope. For 1 second, the raft floated close enough for me to jump. Ari looked back at me, her face white with rain, fear, and the choice she had not made. Then the next wave lifted the raft and dragged it away into the dark, taking the supplies, the emergency bag, and the fake survivor with it. I stood alone on the broken deck with dead cameras, a flooding hull, and the waterproof case Ren had thrown at me like a joke. The yacht cracked beneath my feet, a tearing sound ripped through the deck, and the ocean rushed between the 2 halves like a black mouth. I threw myself toward a floating wall panel, my hands hit slick fiberglass. I missed the first grip, caught the second, and locked both arms around it. The mast collapsed behind me with a sound like a tree snapping inside a metal cage. The current pulled me away from the wreck. Rain blinded me. Every wave lifted me high enough to see nothing but darkness, then dropped me into freezing water that stole my breath. I kept the camera case hooked under one arm. It was heavy and stupid. It made swimming harder, but it was the only thing Ren had not taken. A wave flipped the panel. I went under. Salt water filled my nose, and my knee struck something sharp beneath the surface. I kicked upward and broke through the foam, coughing so hard my chest burned. The case strap was still wrapped around my wrist. The storm did not care whether I hated Ren. It did not care whether Ari felt guilty. It only cared about weight, current, and distance. So I stopped thinking about betrayal. I counted waves. Every 7th wave lifted higher. Every 3rd pull of the current dragged me left. Between 2 flashes of lightning, I saw a darker line ahead. Not another wave. Land. A strip of island cutting across the horizon. I angled the panel toward it. I did not swim straight. Straight was for people who still had strength. I let the current carry most of my weight. By the time my knees hit sand, I had no idea how long I had been in the water. I crawled until the waves stopped touching my boots. I collapsed on my stomach and vomited salt water into the sand. My hands shook so hard that the camera case rattled beside my ribs. The island was silent in a way the ocean was not. Behind me, waves roared. Ahead of me, black trees moved like a wall of watching bodies. I wanted to scream. I wanted to curse Ren until my throat tore open. Instead, I rolled onto my back and forced air into my lungs. Anger could wait. Warmth could not. Water could not. Shelter could not. The island did not owe me time to feel betrayed. I dragged the case higher up the beach. My fingers were numb, but the latch opened. Inside, the camera had survived inside its padded shell. There was also a small solar panel, 2 memory cards, a cracked lens cloth, a folding multi-tool, and a coil of thin cable. It looked pathetic compared to the supplies Ren had stolen. No food, no bottle, no blanket, just the remains of a job he thought was useless. I almost laughed. He had thrown me the thing he respected least, and it was the only thing on this beach that could still remember accurately. I switched the camera on. The battery icon blinked low, but the screen came alive. My face appeared for a second, pale and covered in salt. I turned the lens away from myself. Ren used cameras to fake survival. I was not going to waste mine filming despair for an audience that was not here. I pointed it at the ocean. The tide was still climbing. Foam reached one line of shells, then stopped, then reached farther on the next wave. My hands stopped shaking when the frame gave me something measurable. The beach was not just sand. It was a graph written in water. I filmed the highest wet mark on the shore. Then I filmed the slope, the debris line, the wind-bent grass, and the shape of the nearby rocks. I spoke into the microphone because silence made the fear louder. I said my name was Kema, and I was still alive on an unknown island. I said the raft was gone, the supplies were gone. Ren and Eri were alive when I last saw them. I did not say what I wanted to do to him. I marked the time by the moon and estimated the tide from the waterline. My voice sounded flat, like I was reading someone else's report. That was useful. Panic adds drama, reports add order. I needed order more than I needed comfort, warmth, or the right to hate him. I reviewed the last few minutes of footage. The waves were climbing higher than they looked when I watched them with my eyes. My first instinct had been to sleep beside a fallen palm near the water. The camera showed the wet line already reaching its roots. If I slept there, the tide would roll over me before dawn. I would wake up choking if I woke up at all, and no one would ever know why. I forced myself to stand, my legs trembled. I lifted the case and moved toward the rocks above the beach, scanning for a hollow out of the wind. The first hollow was dry but full of insect shells. The second smelled like rot. The third sat above the tide line and faced away from the wind. I checked the angle with the camera screen. The grass outside leaned past the entrance instead of into it. That meant the wind would not cut straight through. I dragged palm leaves and broken branches inside. It was not a shelter. It was a scratch in the rock with a roof made of desperation. Still, it was higher than the water and shielded from the worst wind. On an island that had almost killed me, that counted as luxury. I placed the camera case behind my back to block the cold rock. Then I curled up in the hollow and watched the beach through the rain. The tide rose exactly where the footage said it would. Water swallowed the lower sand and reached the fallen palm I had almost chosen. I stared at the dark water around its roots for a long time. The camera had not given me food or fire, but it had already saved my life once. That was when I understood the real difference between Ren and me. He used the lens to make himself look larger than reality. I used the lens to make reality harder to lie about, even when the truth was ugly, cold, wet, and waiting for me in the dark. Sleep came in broken pieces. I woke every few minutes to cold, pain, and the fear that the water had found a new path to me. Before dawn, the rain thinned. My clothes were still wet, but the wind had shifted. The hollow smelled of stone, leaves, salt, and my own fear. I opened the case and checked the screen again. The battery had dropped, but not died. The solar panel might save it once the sun rose. I replayed the shot of the wreck as the yacht split. For a few frames, floating debris moved in a clear diagonal before darkness covered the lens. The current had pulled the lighter pieces left, but the heavier section of hull would not drift the same way. It would follow the slower coastal pull. I did not need hope. Hope was too soft and too expensive. I needed a direction, and the footage gave me one clear enough to follow. When the sun finally broke through the gray clouds, the island appeared around me in layers. Black rocks, pale sand, twisted trees, and no visible smoke. That meant Ren and Eri were not near me, or they had no fire, or they were already hiding from the same island I had just met. I pushed the thought away. I had one task: find the wreckage before the next tide took the best materials back into the sea. My stomach cramped as I walked. Every step made my wet shoes scrape skin from my heels. I kept the camera in one hand and the multi-tool in the other. I filmed as I moved, the curve of the shore, the debris lines, the direction of broken foam, the places where birds circled above the rocks. Birds did not care about my survival, but they cared about fish, trash, and things the sea had thrown up. Their circles were information. After an hour, I saw the first piece of white fiberglass jammed between two stones, then another, then a length of rope tangled around driftwood. My pace quickened, though my legs hated me for it. The beach curved around a black cliff, and the smell of fuel reached me before the view did. The yacht's broken belly lay across the rocks like a dead animal. One side was ripped open, panels, cables, plastic sheets, and containers scattered below it. I stopped at the edge of the rocks and raised the camera. The zoom shook in my hands, but the image was clear enough to confirm the wreck. There were no people moving near the wreck. No Wren, no Airy, no rescue crew. Just gulls, foam, and a fortune of materials waiting to be claimed. For the first time since the raft disappeared, I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the kind of smile a starving man gives a locked pantry. Wren had taken the raft, the emergency bag, and the role of survivor. He had left me with the camera, the storm, and the wreckage. He thought he had thrown me away, but the ocean had brought me his entire set, and every broken piece was now mine to study. I lowered the camera and started recording again. My voice was hoarse, but steady. I said the first objective was water, then shelter, then inventory. The fourth objective was not dying before sunset. That sounded simple enough to say, but the island had already taught me not to trust simple things. Then I looked at the ruined yacht and understood one more thing. If I used it correctly, this wreck was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a base, and the camera Wren threw away with me would become the first tool that helped me build it. The wreck looked larger from the cliff than it had through the camera. Broken white fiberglass covered the rocks like bones from a giant sea animal. I did not run toward it. Running was for people with water in their stomachs and strength in their legs. I had neither, and one stupid step could end everything. I sat on a flat stone and filmed the wreck from above. The camera shook in my hands, but the screen gave me distance my eyes could not keep. One section of hull rested above the tide line. Another section lay too close to the water. Loose panels shifted whenever a wave reached them. The sea was already planning to steal from me. I needed to decide what mattered before the tide made the decision for both of us. I spoke into the camera in a dry voice. Panel pieces first, containers second, rope and cable third, anything sealed fourth. I did not say food first. Hunger was loud, but thirst was the real clock. A starving man could still think. A dehydrated man became meat. The cliff path down was narrow and slick with algae. I tested each foothold before trusting it. Falling now would give Wren the ending he wanted. At the bottom, the fuel smell grew sharper. It mixed with salt, splintered wood, wet plastic, and the sweet rot of seaweed trapped between stones. I walked the edge of the wreck without touching anything. First pass was only observation. Hands make promises before the brain understands the cost. The camera recorded every angle. I filmed cracked panels, torn cable bundles, empty storage lockers, bent rails, and the jagged line where the hull had split. A broken cooler lay wedged between rocks. I opened it and found nothing but melted ice water mixed with salt and fish blood. I wanted to drink it anyway. My throat begged for any liquid. I shut the lid and stepped back before desperation became a decision. Beside the cooler, a long metal support rod had snapped free from the interior wall. It was bent, but one end still formed a clean handle. I pulled it loose and almost fell backward when it came free. The rod was heavier than it looked, but its length mattered more than its weight. A lever was just a promise that distance could replace muscle. I had very little muscle left. Distance would have to do the work. I marked 3 large panels with scratches from the multi-tool. One could become a roof, one could become a wall, one could become a floor off the sand. Then I found the first thing that made me pause. A boot print sat in the mud beside the upper rocks, too deep and too square to be mine. It was not Wren's shoe either. Wren wore expensive survival boots with fake scratches and a bright orange sole for product shots. This print had a heavy tread, military pattern, and dry mud pressed over wet mud. It had been made after the storm began to weaken. I crouched and filmed it. The lens caught the deep heel, the crushed grass, and the line of disturbed soil leading toward the trees. Near the print, a strip of black synthetic rope hung from a branch. It was not yacht rope. It was too new, too smooth, and cut too cleanly. Under a stone, I found a small brass casing darkened by salt. I picked it up with 2 fingers and held it in front of the camera. I did not know who had been here. I only knew the island was no longer empty inside my calculations, and that changed every plan after water. Panic tried to climb up my spine. I forced it down. Unknown people were a future problem. The tide was a current problem. I placed the casing in the waterproof case. Evidence weighed almost nothing. Ignoring evidence could weigh more than a grave. Back at the wreck, I wedged the metal rod under the first panel. The panel did not move. My arms shook from the first attempt. I adjusted the stone under the rod, moving the pivot point closer to the panel. The second attempt lifted one edge by a finger's width. That finger's width was enough. I shoved a smaller rock beneath the lifted edge, reset the rod, and leaned my weight onto the handle again. The panel groaned across the stone. It moved less than a handspan. I breathed through my teeth and told the camera that motion was motion. I worked in small victories. Lift, block, shift, rest, film the angle. Check the tide. Repeat until the panel reached safer ground. The sun climbed higher. Heat settled on my shoulders like wet cloth. My tongue felt too large for my mouth, and every breath scraped my throat. I kept looking at the sealed containers near the hull, but none promised clean water. Plastic bins could become reservoirs, but only after I had water to store. A length of rope tangled around the lower rail. I pulled it free and found it half ruined, but the core strand still held under tension. Farther up the slope, vines hung from low trees where the jungle met the rocks. I cut one and tested it by wrapping it around my wrist. It flexed, stretched, and did not snap. Not proper rope, but useful enough if I used it in bundles instead of trusting one strand. I tied 3 vines together, then wrapped them around the panel. The knots were ugly, but the load only needed to slide, not hang. Using the metal rod as a lever and the vines as drag lines, I moved the first roof panel above the tide mark before the next wave reached it. I sat beside it and laughed once without sound. The laugh hurt my throat, so I stopped before celebration cost me water I did not have. The second panel was wider and heavier. I could not move it directly. I placed round driftwood beneath it and turned the problem into rolling friction. The first log snapped under the weight. I cursed, replaced it with 2 shorter pieces, and spread the pressure across a wider surface. The panel crawled forward. Every push felt useless until I looked back and saw the trail it had carved across the wet sand. That was the trick of slow work. The body felt nothing changing, while the ground quietly proved otherwise, one ugly mark at a time. By midday, I had 3 panels, 2 containers, a torn sheet of clear plastic, a coil of cable, and half a bag of cracked fasteners. I had also lost too much sweat. My hands cramped around the metal rod. When I tried to stand, black spots moved across my vision. I sat in the shade of the hull and reviewed the footage. The shore curved inward north of the wreck, where palm shadows crossed a higher patch of sand. The slope there was better. Wind would pass over it instead of through it. It sat above the tide line and close enough to the wreck for hauling. That would become the camp. Not because it looked comfortable, but because the camera, the slope, and the wind all agreed. I dragged the first panel there by using the vines as a harness across my chest. Every step pulled pain through my ribs. Ren would have called it pathetic footage. A real survival hero would carry the panel on his shoulders and grin at the camera. A real idiot would collapse before sunset. I preferred pathetic and alive, especially when alive still had a chance to build something. The shelter started as 3 ugly angles. A floor panel rested on stones. A wall panel leaned into 2 forked branches. The roof panel sat low and slanted. I used cable to bind the corners and vines to hold tension. The whole thing looked like trash trying to become architecture. But when the wind crossed the beach, it struck the slanted roof and moved over it instead of ripping straight under the edge. I crawled inside and felt shade cover my face. It was not home. It was not safe. But it was a place where the sun could not bite me directly. Then I returned to the real problem. Shelter without water was just a nicer place to die, and I was not building a grave with a roof. The clear plastic sheet was torn on one side, but the center remained intact. I spread it on the sand and checked it against the sun. It was not glass. It was not clean, but it could trap heat and hold condensation if I made the ground work with it instead of against it. I dug a pit with a broken metal plate. The sand near the top was dry, but deeper down it held dampness that darkened under my fingers. I placed the smaller container in the center of the pit. Around it, I packed wet sand, crushed leaves, and strips of soaked cloth from the wreck. The camera watched from a stone beside me. I spoke out loud because explaining the structure forced me to notice mistakes before thirst did. Evaporation rises. Plastic catches it. A low point guides the drops. The container waits in the center. Simple if the seals hold. I stretched the plastic over the pit and buried the edges under sand and stones. Then I placed a small pebble in the center above the container. The sheet dipped downward into a shallow cone. It looked ridiculous. It also looked like the only reason I might see another morning. I waited. Waiting was worse than work. Work gave pain a purpose. Waiting left me alone with my throat and the sound of empty air. The first drops were not visible. I had to lower the camera close and use the zoom to see mist gathering on the underside of the plastic. Then one bead formed. It grew fat, trembled, slid down the cone, and dropped into the container with a sound too small for the world to respect. I respected it. I watched the second drop follow, then the third, until the slow little machine became the loudest proof on the beach. I did not drink immediately. The first mouthful had to be enough to matter. I used the waiting time to build a second, smaller pit beside the first. By late afternoon, the container held less than a cup. I lifted it carefully, afraid my shaking hands would spill the most valuable thing on the island. The water tasted warm, flat, and faintly of plastic. It was the best thing I had ever tasted because it had not been given to me. My body wanted me to drink everything. My brain stopped my hand halfway. A system that dies in one swallow is not a system. I drank half and poured the rest into a sealed bottle I had found under the wreck bench. Future Kima deserved a vote in this decision. The shelter, the water pit, the rope bundle, the marked panels, the evidence casing, and the foodless wreck all went into the camera before sunset. Not for an audience, for memory. Exhaustion edits reality, and I needed one witness on this island that would not flatter or panic. I reviewed the map in my head. North held the wreck. East held dense trees. West held the beach where I came ashore. South remained unknown. South also held the direction where the boot prints seemed to lead. I did not like that. I marked it with 3 scratches on a flat stone. As the sky turned orange, birds circled over the rocks again. Some landed near the wreck, pecking at seaweed and broken food packaging. I followed them cautiously and found a sealed packet wedged under a cracked cabinet. The label was ruined, but the contents were dry. Inside were 3 emergency biscuits crushed into powder. I stared at them before eating one pinch, because even crumbs had become strategy. Ren had taken the supply crate, but the wreck still had crumbs he had been too proud or too rushed to search for, and pride could not digest. The powder turned to paste in my mouth. It stuck to my teeth and tasted like cardboard, salt, and survival that refused to become a meal. I saved the rest in a metal tin. Food was not a meal anymore. It was a number I had to stretch across unknown days and worse decisions. The sun dropped behind the trees. My shelter cast a long shadow over the sand. The pressures of the day became different at night. Cold returned. Insects started screaming in the grass. Something moved in the jungle and stopped whenever I turned my head. I made no fire. Smoke could help rescuers. Smoke could also help whoever left the boot print. I was not ready to be seen. I sat inside the shelter with the camera on my knees and watched the last light fade from the wreck, counting sounds I could not identify. That was when I saw movement on the far beach, small at first, then steady enough to prove it was not driftwood or a trick of the fading light. 2 figures staggered along the waterline, too far to hear and too uneven to be locals moving through familiar ground or hunters returning home. I lifted the camera and zoomed in. The image wavered in the dusk, then sharpened enough to show a torn jacket and a red waterproof bag. Ren walked in front, bent forward but still trying to lead. Eri followed behind him, carrying the bag with both arms like a shield. They were alive. Their raft was not with them. Their supply crate was not visible. The fake survivor had run out of stage props. My first feeling was not mercy. It was not triumph either. It was calculation, cold and clean enough to shame me later if I survived. I had water, I had shade, I had the beginning of a wall. I also had more work than one starving body could finish before the island changed again. Ren was dangerous as an enemy. He was also strong. Eri had watched enough shoots to understand equipment and notes if she chose to think. I could hide and let the island teach them slowly, or I could let them find the smoke I had not made and the shelter they had not earned. I checked the water bottle. I checked the panels stacked beside the shelter. I checked the camera battery blinking red in the corner of the screen. Then I aimed the lens at Ren and Eri as they stumbled closer across the dying light, because this moment deserved to be remembered accurately. I did not wave. I did not call out. I simply recorded the moment the people who abandoned me found the first working camp on the island. Ren had thrown me away with a camera and no supplies. By sunset of the next day, that camera had found water, shelter, evidence, and leverage. The island had not made me safe. Not yet. But for the first time since the storm, I had something stronger than anger and more useful than revenge. I had a system, and the people who had abandoned me were walking straight toward it, thirsty, frightened, and no longer in control of the story. Ren reached the edge of my camp just before full dark. He tried to stand straight, but thirst had already bent his shoulders forward. Ari stopped 2 steps behind him. The red waterproof bag hung from her arms, lighter than it had been on the raft and far less useful now. I kept the camera running from inside the shadow of the shelter. The lens caught his torn jacket, cracked lips, and the pride still holding him upright. Ren saw the slanted roof, the stacked panels, the tied vines, and the 2 plastic-covered water pits. His face tightened before he forced a smile. He laughed once and called it a garbage hut. His voice came out rough from thirst, but he still tried to make the insult sound casual. Ari did not laugh. Her eyes stayed on the clear plastic pit and the sealed bottle resting in the shade beside my shelter. Ren walked past the wall frame as if he owned the space. He pointed at the bottle and told me to bring it over like a servant on his set. I did not move. The island was quiet around us, and that made his voice sound louder than it deserved, but volume was not authority here. I looked at his hands. They were empty. No raft rope. No supply crate, no food bag, no tool, just bruised knuckles and wet sand. Ari whispered that they had lost the raft on the southern rocks. Ren cut his eyes at her, and she stopped talking immediately. He said the raft was damaged by the storm, not lost. Then he repeated that all resources had to be gathered under one leader. I asked him where his supplies were. The question landed harder than I expected. His jaw moved once, but no answer came. The camera sat beside my knee, recording every second. Ren noticed the red light and straightened, as if an audience had returned. He smiled toward the lens and said cooperation was essential during survival. Then he told me to hand over the water before I wasted more time. I picked up the bottle and held it where he could see the level. Less than half remained after the first day, and every swallow mattered now. I said no. The word was small, but the camp seemed to sharpen around it. Even the insects sounded quieter after I spoke. Ren stared at me, waiting for the rest of the sentence. There was none. Some answers do not need decoration, especially when water is scarce. I reminded him that the yacht had been broken by the sea, abandoned by him, and carried here by a current he did not bother to read. For a moment, the fake smile slipped completely. Without cameras to flatter him, Ren looked less like a star and more like a thirsty man with bad math. He told Ari to stay back. Then he said he would show me what real survival looked like and walked toward the jungle with theatrical anger. Ari looked at me, then at the bottle. I saw the question in her eyes. I did not answer it for her, because she had to start seeing alone. Ren returned 10 minutes later with a stick in one hand and scratches across his forearm. He had tried to spear crabs in the dark. The crabs had apparently disagreed with his professional reputation. Blood ran from 2 small cuts, and he looked angrier than the wounds deserved. He dropped 3 bright red berries onto a flat stone and announced that dinner had arrived. His voice reached for confidence and missed. Ari leaned toward them. Hunger makes colors look kinder than they are. I caught her wrist before her fingers touched the fruit. Ren snapped at me to let go. I ignored him and pointed to the white sap leaking from the broken stem of one berry, thick as glue. I picked up a small piece of shell and touched the sap. It turned cloudy and sticky against the edge within seconds, like bad resin. I said I would not test poison on Ari just because Ren needed an audience. The sentence hit him harder than a shove, because she heard it. Ren kicked the stone, sending the berries into the sand. He said I was making guesses sound like science because I was afraid of real risk. I opened the camera playback and showed them the clip from the morning. Same leaves, same berries, same empty circle where insects refused to feed. The screen was small, but the truth did not need to be large. Ari watched without blinking. Ren looked away first, and that mattered. I walked to the edge of the camp and dug beside a flat-leaf plant I had marked earlier. Under the roots were 3 pale tubers. They were small, ugly, and covered in dirt. They did not look like food for a survival show. That made them more trustworthy. I scraped one clean with the multi-tool and cut it open. The inside was firm, white, and smelled faintly like raw chestnut. I chewed a thin slice first and waited. My stomach cramped from hunger, but no burning came to my tongue or throat, so I kept breathing. Only then did I hand Ari a piece. She hesitated, then ate it. Her eyes closed for 1 second, not from pleasure, but relief. Ren refused the first piece. 5 minutes later, he took the second without meeting my eyes. Hunger had better arguments than pride. The tubers were not enough for 3 people. They were barely enough for 1. But they proved something important about noise and value. Ren could find drama. I could find calories. On this island, that difference was already becoming a law stronger than his old reputation. He tried to recover by choosing a new campsite. He pointed down the beach to a smooth stretch of sand near a fallen palm. He said it was open, flat, close to the water, and visually perfect. The last phrase told me exactly how he had survived his own show. Ari looked at the place and almost nodded. It did look easier than my crooked shelter on the higher slope, and easy is a dangerous word. I picked up the camera and opened the footage from the night before. The screen showed waves climbing farther up the sand with each cycle. I paused on the frame where foam reached the fallen palm, the same palm Ren had just chosen as the center of his beautiful camp. I walked to the palm and planted a stick where the waterline had been, then I stepped back and let the island make my argument. Ren called it meaningless. He said one storm did not define a beach. He said I was hiding behind footage because I was afraid to lead. 2 hours later, the tide reached the stick, then it covered the roots, then it spread across the flat sand where Ren wanted to sleep. Ari stood beside me and watched the water erase his perfect campsite. Her face changed in the moonlight as the proof reached her. Ren did not apologize. He said the tide was unusually high. He said the island was unpredictable. He said anything except the obvious. I turned the camera toward the water and spoke softly. Data does not need pride to be useful. It only needs to be remembered. That was when Ari finally asked how much water I had. Not Ren. Ari. Her voice was careful, but it did not ask through him. I showed her the bottle, the 2 pits, and the expected output. I said it was not enough for 3 mouths unless 3 bodies worked. Ren laughed again, but the sound had lost weight. He said I was not serious if I expected him to work for water under my orders. I pointed at the stones beside the shelter. The wall needed a second layer before wind or animals found the weak side after midnight. I said the rule once. Food, water, and shelter came from work. Status did not count. Applause did not count. Old titles did not count. Ari lowered the red bag from her arms. She asked what she could do. Ren turned toward her like she had betrayed him a second time. I told her to sort the smaller fasteners by size and keep the vines damp so they would not crack when tightened around the frame. Then I handed Ren the empty container and pointed to the stone pile below the slope. He stared at it as if I had offered him a collar. He said he was the reason the show existed. I said the show was not here. The island was, and the island did not subscribe. Ari looked down before I could see whether she wanted to laugh. Ren saw the motion anyway, and it cut him open more than thirst. He took 1 step toward me. His shoulders were still broad. Even exhausted, he could have hurt me if strength were the only rule. I did not reach for the multi-tool. I lifted the bottle instead and poured 1 swallow of water into a shell cup where he could see it. The sound of that small pour stopped him. Water had become a language everyone on the island understood without translation. I set the cup on a flat stone between us. Then I pointed again to the pile. Work first, water after. The rule was ugly and clear. Ren looked at Ari. She did not speak for him. That silence did more damage than any insult I could have designed with the camera running. He picked up the container with a hand that shook from anger and thirst. Then he walked down the slope toward the stones. I watched him choose the largest rocks first, because pride still wanted to perform strength. He nearly dropped the second on his foot. I did not correct him immediately. A lesson taught by weight enters faster than a lecture taught by someone you hate and refuse to hear. After the 5th trip, his breathing turned ragged. After the 8th, his hands bled where the rough stones had scraped his palms. Ari sorted fasteners beside the shelter. She kept glancing at him, not with admiration now, but with the expression of someone watching a costume tear. I showed her how to group the cracked bolts, curved hooks, and usable washers. She learned quickly when Ren was not speaking over her. The wall rose slowly. Stone at the base, fiberglass panel behind it, vine tension across the upper frame. Ugly, but harder to break. Ren returned with another load and dropped it too close to the water pit. I told him to move it 2 steps left before it tore the cover. He opened his mouth to argue. Then he looked at the shell cup, closed his mouth, and moved the stone without turning it into a speech. When the section was finished, I checked the wall with my hand. It held. Not perfectly, but better than it had before he started carrying. I filled the shell cup from the bottle, not much, enough to wet his mouth and prove the rule was real, measurable, and repeatable. Ren stared at the cup for a long second, then he grabbed it and drank so fast water ran down his chin onto his torn collar. Ren wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. He said this changed nothing. His voice came out too quiet to convince even himself. He wanted to look angry while drinking. Thirst did not let him. For those few seconds, he looked only human and very far from his poster. Ari watched the whole thing. She saw the man who had left me to die work for a mouthful from the camp he had mocked hours earlier. I did not smile. The camera recorded enough. Some humiliations become weaker when the victim sees you enjoying them too openly. I told him it changed the wall. That was the only answer that mattered. The stones were higher, and the night wind would have to work harder. Ari asked if she could have water after finishing the fasteners. I gave her the same amount I gave Ren, because rules had to stay clean. Her hands trembled around the shell cup. Before drinking, she looked at me and said she should have spoken on the raft when it mattered. The words landed in the camp like another object to inventory. I could not use them yet, but I did not throw them away either. I told her guilt was not a resource unless it became work. She nodded once and returned to sorting metal under the moonlight. Ren heard that and looked away. He had no apology to offer, only a throat that wanted more water and hands that still needed to carry stone. By midnight, the wall stood waist-high on the weak side. The shelter looked less like trash and more like something refusing to die. I marked the new structure on camera: water output, wall progress, food remaining, evidence of unknown visitors. 2 additional people in camp. I did not call them allies. A camera should not lie before the facts are ready, and the facts still had teeth under the softest words. Ren lay near the outer wall without permission to enter the shelter. Ari sat closer to the opening, but not inside it yet. I stayed awake longer than both of them, not from strength, from distrust. Sleep is easier when the people near you did not recently leave you to drown. Sometime after the moon moved above the trees, a branch cracked beyond the southern brush. Not near the beach, not near the wreck. My hand went to the camera before the multi-tool. The lens could reach farther than my knife, and distance mattered in the dark. I aimed into the dark and saw nothing at first. Then the screen caught a pale mark in the mud beyond the first row of trees. At dawn, I walked there while Ren and Ari still slept. The mark was a footprint, fresh, not mine, not Ren's, not Ari's. This one crossed near our camp, not the wreck. Whoever had left the first trail had come closer during the night to study us. I filmed the print, the broken branch, and the angle of approach. The person had been watching us from the south, behind the blind side. Behind me, Ari woke and followed quietly. She saw the print before Ren did. This time, she did not ask him what it meant. She asked me, and that tiny shift told me more than any apology could have told me beside the water pits that morning, before Ren woke. I looked toward the trees, then back at the unfinished wall. Yesterday, the island had been a test of water, shelter, and pride. Today, it had become a test of territory, and territory was harder to defend than a bottle or a roof panel tied with vines. Ren woke behind us and shouted for an explanation. His voice sounded stronger after water, but not stronger enough to own the answer. I kept filming the trees. Somewhere beyond them, someone else had looked at my camp and decided not to enter yet, which meant a mind. That meant they were cautious. Cautious people were more dangerous than hungry animals because they could wait for a better opening. I closed the camera screen and turned back toward the camp. The wall was too low. The south side was blind. The rules had to change again. Ren followed my gaze and finally stopped talking. For once, he saw the same thing I did. The island had more players than us. The first working camp had become visible, and visibility was not the same thing as safety. It was a signal sent in every direction. The print stayed in the mud like a sentence written by someone who wanted us to find the first word and fear the rest of the message. Ren stood behind me, breathing louder than the morning needed. Ari crouched beside the mark, careful not to touch the edges. I filmed the print from 3 angles: heel depth, toe direction, broken branch, distance from the south brush to the camp wall. Whoever left it had not wandered by accident. They had stopped where the trees gave them cover and where our unfinished wall showed its weakest side. Ren said my smoke had brought them. Then he remembered I had made no fire and changed the accusation to my walls, my water, my camp. His fear needed someone to blame. That was easier than admitting the island had been watched before any of us understood its rules. I told him shouting at footprints would not make them smaller. Then I pointed to the blind south side and assigned him the first task. He stared at me like the words had insulted him twice. I repeated the task. More stones, taller wall. No speeches until the south side held. Ari looked at the print, then at the shelter, then at the camera in my hand. This time she asked what I needed from her. That question mattered. On the raft, she had waited for Ren to become brave. In my camp, she was beginning to ask where she could be useful. I told her to bring every small metal piece, shell, bottle cap, broken hook, and empty tin she could find near the wreck. Ren laughed that I was building jewelry while someone stalked us. I told him sound travels farther than courage when courage is only noise. We built the first signal line from cable, vine, cracked tins, and shells. It looked childish until I pulled the cord and heard it scream. The whole south side rattled like a dry skeleton. Birds jumped from the trees. Ren stopped laughing and looked toward the brush. That was the sound I wanted, not loud enough to call the island, loud enough to wake a tired body before a knife reached the wall. We set 3 lines by noon, low for legs, chest high for careless hands, one loose line near the blind corner where the watcher had stood. Ren wanted spikes. I refused. A warning system was better than a murder trap when we still did not know who watched us from the trees. The wall grew ugly and fast. Stone at the base, bent panels in the gaps, vines wet from shade, cable wrapped where vines might stretch. My hands ached from tying knots. Ren carried stones with angry efficiency. Anger was a poor leader, but a useful fuel if given a direction. Eri moved differently now. She did not wait near Ren. She crossed between piles, sorted fasteners, and kept glancing at the camera screen. By afternoon, she asked to see the footage from the last 2 days. I almost said no before remembering that distrust could also waste labor. I handed her the camera and watched her hold it like something fragile, not because it was expensive, but because it had started telling the truth. She sat under the slanted roof and reviewed the clips. Tide line, wreck path, berries, wall progress, the first boot print near the rocks. At first she only watched. Then she began scratching marks onto a flat sheet of bark with a sharpened piece of charcoal. She marked the wreck to the north. The beach where I came ashore to the west, the southern brush with 3 short lines. She paused on one frame and leaned closer. In the corner behind my shoulder, a narrow gap between trees appeared twice from different angles. I had missed it because I was measuring the wall. She circled the gap on the bark and said it might be a path worth checking later. I looked at the screen again. She was right. The ground beyond it was darker, pressed down in a way wind could not explain. That was the first useful thing Eri found without being told what to find. I made myself say it out loud because useful work deserved record. Ren heard and dropped a stone harder than necessary. The sound cracked across the camp, but no one gave it the attention he wanted. By evening, we followed the marked gap only far enough to confirm it existed. I did not enter deep brush with 2 exhausted people and 1 knife. The path smelled of wet leaves and animal musk. It bent away from the beach and climbed toward thicker jungle where the light died early. On a branch near the entrance, I found 3 shallow cuts in a pattern. Not random, not made by claws. A sign, maybe, or a warning. I filmed it. Eri copied the mark onto bark. Ren said symbols did not stop men with weapons. I said neither did his opinion. Night fell with the south signal line tied and the map hidden inside the shelter. I slept badly, but at least I knew where fear had edges. The signal line rang before sunrise, thin and metallic in the gray air, turning every sleeping body in the camp into a listening one. The sound snapped through the camp, thin and metallic. Ren rolled up with a stone in his hand. Eri grabbed the camera before I reached it. I lifted my hand for silence. The tins rattled once more, then stopped. Something stood beyond the south wall where the new line trembled. A man stepped between the trees with a spear held low, not thrown, not raised, but ready. His skin was darkened by sun and smoke. He wore woven fiber around his waist and shoulders, but the blade of his spear was not primitive. It looked like sharpened black glass. Ren moved first, which was exactly the problem. He grabbed a broken branch and shouted like volume could translate itself. The stranger's spear rose by 1 careful inch. Not panic. Response. Ren had turned a question into a threat before we knew the language. I stepped between them before Ren could perform himself into a funeral. My hands were empty and raised where the stranger could see them. Ren hissed that I was insane. I ignored him and backed toward the water pit without turning my shoulders away from the spear. I filled a shell cup from the sealed bottle. Not much. Enough to show clarity. Enough to show we had something besides fear. I placed the cup on the ground halfway between us and stepped back. The stranger watched my hands more than my face, which made sense. That made sense. Faces lie. Hands kill. I kept mine open and still because one wrong gesture could make our first contact our last. Eri stood near the shelter, recording with the camera. For once, she kept the lens steady without being told, even with fear in her hands. The stranger approached the cup in 3 slow steps. He sniffed it first. Then he dipped one finger and tasted the water. His eyes changed, not with trust, but with interest. Clean water can cross a language gap faster than any speech or friendly smile. Ren muttered that we should take his spear before he brought more people. The stranger did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. I turned to Ren and told him to sit down. He stared at me. I said it again, quieter, because I meant it more than before. For a second, his pride fought his thirst, fear, and the memory of last night's shell cup. Then he lowered himself beside the wall. The stranger saw that too. He looked from Ren to me and understood at least one rule of our camp. The loudest man was not the leader. He pointed to the water pit, then to the cup, then to the jungle. A question, maybe a request, maybe a trade offer without shared words. I picked up a broken strip of clear plastic and mimed sunlight, steam, drops, and the container. It was a terrible performance, but an honest one. The stranger watched carefully. Then he tapped his chest and said a name I could not repeat correctly. I called him the Hunter in my notes. He gestured for me to follow. Ren immediately said it was a trap. Ari looked at me, waiting for my decision, not his loud fear. I took the camera, the multi-tool, and the shell cup. I told Ren to guard the camp, not because I trusted him, but because he was too loud for diplomacy. Leaving him behind wounded him more than danger would have. He wanted to be necessary in every scene. The island had begun editing him out. Ari came with me. She carried the bark map, charcoal, and the red bag that had finally become a container instead of a symbol. We followed the hunter through the marked path. He moved without snapping twigs. I moved like a man made of mistakes, trying to learn from each sound. The path climbed between roots and wet stones. Twice, he stopped and waited for us to see where the ground dipped into hidden mud. He was not showing off. He was teaching us not to die while following him. That was the first generous thing the island had offered. After half an hour, the trees opened around a small hollow of huts woven from palm, bark, and curved branches near a smoky fire pit. People watched from doorways. Children hid behind older women. No one rushed us. No one smiled. The entire place held its breath. I did not raise the camera to their faces. A lens can feel like a weapon when people have not agreed to become proof for strangers. Instead, I filmed my own hands building a smaller water pit with clear plastic, a clay-colored bowl, wet leaves, and a cup at the center. The hunter crouched beside me. Ari copied every step on the bark map, drawing arrows for sun, vapor, plastic, and the cup. When the first drops formed, the people leaned closer. A child pointed. An old woman touched the outside of the plastic and frowned at the heat. The amount was tiny, but the idea was not. Dirty ground, wet leaves, and sunlight could become drinkable water if the shape was right. The hunter listened to my broken gestures, then stood and motioned for us to follow deeper behind the huts toward a fallen tree. He led us to a bank of gray earth exposed by a fallen tree. The soil there held together in his hand instead of falling like sand. Clay? The word left my mouth before I could stop it. Storage, cups, cooking pots, better seals for water pits. A real step forward. Ari wrote the mark for clay on the bark map 3 times. She understood it too. This was not decoration. This was infrastructure. The hunter gave me a small stone blade with a black glass edge, obsidian, or something close enough to obey the same rules. I accepted it with both hands, not as a trophy, as a contract. He had given us a tool, and tools demanded responsibility. On the way back, he showed us 2 plants with edible fruit and 1 vine whose sap caused burning if touched with wet skin. Ari filmed the leaves and repeated their shapes under her breath. She was no longer just recording events. She was building memory for the camp. When we reached my wall, Ren was waiting with 2 stones in his hands and an expression that wanted to be anger, but looked more like exclusion. He stared at the stone blade in my hand. Then he stared at the hunter walking beside me as if we had returned with a crown. The hunter ignored him completely. He walked to the water pit, crouched, and watched the plastic cone drip into the cup. Ren said he had guarded the camp while we played tourists. Ari did not answer. She went straight to the map and added the clay bank. That silence hit him again. Every time she chose work over reassurance, his old throne lost another plank beneath his feet. I checked the traps near the brush. A bent vine loop had caught a small ground bird by the leg without breaking it, which was better than I expected. I freed it quickly and reset the loop lower, ashamed of the rough design, but relieved the idea worked without killing everything it touched. Ren said the bird was too small to matter. 10 minutes later, he ate part of it roasted on hot stone and did not repeat the sentence. The hunter watched him eat, then looked at me. Not with admiration, with calculation. He was deciding what kind of people we were. That was fair. I was deciding the same thing about his people, the prints, the casing, and the warning still hiding behind his eyes. After the meal, the hunter drew in the sand with the blunt end of his spear. First a curved line for the shore, then a small boat. He added men beside it and tapped the spear point against the drawing. Then he made a sharp cracking sound with his mouth. Gunfire. I knew it before Ari whispered the word because the casing in my waterproof case had already taught me the shape of that threat. The hunter drew boxes, then crossed them out. He touched his own wrist, mimed binding, and pointed toward the deeper trees. My stomach tightened. The casing near the wreck, the synthetic rope, the boot print, the careful approach to our camp. The pieces locked together. These were not ghosts, not lost tourists, not another wrecked crew. Armed strangers came here, took what they wanted, and left fear behind. Ren tried to straighten. He said if they came, he would handle them. His hand brushed the stones near the wall like they made him an army. The hunter looked at him for the first time since arriving. Then he looked away with no expression at all, which was somehow worse than laughter. Ren's mouth tightened. He reached for another piece of the roasted bird and realized everyone had seen who caught it, who cooked it, and who made it possible. He still ate. Hunger was honest even when he was not, and the hunter saw that truth before Ren found a new excuse to protect his pride. People like Ren
cannot admit failure while their image is still breathing. A fake expert does not only protect pride, he protects the character that fed him. That is why reality has to corner him through water, food, and witnesses. Each quiet proof from Kema takes away one excuse, until Ren has nothing left but the work he once mocked.
The hunter tapped the drawing again, harder this time. Then he pointed at the sky, curled his fingers like wind, and pushed his hand over the sand. Ari understood first. She looked toward the dark clouds gathering above the western trees and said the strangers returned after storms. The hunter nodded. Storms threw cargo onto shore. Storms hid boats. Storms made weak camps weaker and armed men bolder than usual. I looked at our wall, waist high on one side, blind on the south. Signal lines good for warning, not defense against armed men. Ren followed my gaze and, for once, did not joke. His eyes moved from the wall to the jungle and then to the stone cup near the pit. The rules of the island had changed again. Water had brought Ren to my camp. Clean water had brought the hunter to my wall. Now the same system that made us visible might also make us valuable, and valuable things attracted men with weapons and boats. I picked up the camera and filmed the sand drawing before the wind could erase it. Boat, boxes, bound wrists, fire sticks. Then I filmed the wall, the signal lines, the water pits, the clay mark on Ari's map, and the faces of the people waiting for me to decide. My voice stayed flat when I recorded the next objective. Upgrade shelter into perimeter. Upgrade camp into fortified camp. Prepare for storm and human threat. Ren asked if I really thought a few tins and vines could stop men with guns. I looked at the signal line moving in the wind. I said no, tins and vines would not stop them. But rules, walls, maps, water, clay, warnings, and people might slow them long enough for us to live. The hunter listened without understanding every word. Maybe he did not need to. He had brought us the warning. Now he wanted to see what we built from it. By sunset, no one called the camp a garbage hut anymore. Not Ari, not the hunter, not even Ren, who sat near the wall chewing in silence. The first law of the island was water, the second was work, the third arrived with the dark clouds and the drawing in the sand. If we wanted to survive here, we could not just hide from nature. We had to become harder to take, harder to scare, and harder to erase. The clouds did not arrive like scenery. They lowered over the trees in one dark sheet, pressing the whole island into a quieter shape. The hunter watched the sky before he watched us. That told me enough. People who lived here trusted weather signs more than speeches. He touched the sand, drawing one last time, then pointed toward the rocks where his people had hidden paths and stronger shelters. Ari understood his gesture before Ren did. She said his village would pull back before the storm and wait where the wind could not reach. Ren looked offended, as if nature leaving him out of a plan was another insult. Then thunder rolled, and his mouth closed. I looked at our camp. Low wall, slanted roof, 2 water pits, a signal line, a map scratched on bark. Useful, not ready. The storm would not care that we had survived yesterday. It would test every weak knot, every lazy stone, every lie we told ourselves. I opened the camera and reviewed the last weather clips. Wind from the west, tide rising earlier, birds moving inland before noon. Ari brought the bark map. She had already marked the clay bank, the south path, the water pits, and the blind side near the brush. I added storm arrows with charcoal. Not beautiful, not exact, but enough to tell people where force would arrive before it hit us. Ren asked why we did not follow the hunter to the rocks. He tried to make it sound strategic, but fear leaked through the edges. I said the rocks might hold people, but not our water pits, panels, tools, clay marks, or the camp that had started becoming something. If we ran every time the island pushed, we would spend our lives carrying scraps from one temporary fear to the next. The next order had to stay simple enough for tired people to follow. The hunter listened to my tone more than my words. He tested one vine, touched the wall, and gave a short grunt I could not translate. I did not know if that meant approval or warning. On this island, those two things often sounded the same. That was the detail I needed everyone to understand before moving again. He left before the first hard rain. moving into the trees with the same quiet steps that had made our signal line feel childish. Irie watched him disappear, then looked at the map. She asked where to begin. That question was becoming her strongest tool. I pointed to the lower wall. Water would hit there first, not from the sea, but from the slope behind the shelter after the rain gathered strength. Rain on a hill is not just rain. It becomes weight. It becomes movement. It becomes a hand pushing mud through every gap. Ren said he could hold the wall if it came to that. I told him holding was the last choice, not the first plan. He frowned, but he did not argue. The shell cup had taught him that my orders were not decorations. We dug the first drainage trench with broken plates, flat stones, and the edge of the metal support rod from the wreck site. The trench looked too small while we dug it. It always does before water arrives. Dry earth makes preparation feel ridiculous. Ari checked the camera footage and marked where yesterday's rain had pooled near the shelter floor. She was not guessing anymore. She called out weak points as she saw them: left corner, rear slope, low pit edge, loose roof seam above the sleeping space. Ren carried stones without waiting for applause. He still chose the heaviest ones first, but now he put them where I pointed. The wall gained a second skin, not pretty. Stones outside, panels inside, wet vines around the frame, cable where wind would chew hardest. Every knot had to fight two enemies. Water would loosen the fibers. Wind would pull the panels. My hands worked until the skin split. I used clay from the hunter's mark to pack gaps around the water pit edges. It cracked when too dry, so Ari kept it damp with measured drops. Ren saw her measuring water with care and looked away. Yesterday he would have mocked that. Today he had carried stone for less. The first rain arrived soft enough to lie. It tapped the roof like fingers, as if the storm only wanted permission to enter. I sent Ren to move the food tin and dry fasteners into the shelter's highest corner. He lifted both without comment. I held the silence for a breath, then turned it into another instruction. Ari wrapped the bark map in the red waterproof bag. The same bag she had carried from the raft now held something more useful than fear. I filmed the camp before the storm changed it. Not for memory alone this time, but to compare what failed and what survived. The footage would not stop rain, but if we lived, it would tell us which mistake had almost killed us. The second wave of rain came sideways. It blew through the palm line and hit the wall with a hiss like thrown gravel. Ren grabbed a loose panel before it could twist free. He looked at me for the next order instead of announcing his own plan. That tiny pause was progress. Not trust yet, but a man asking for direction is less dangerous than a man performing confidence. I told him to brace the panel from the inside while Ari pulled the vine line through the upper hook. It was not a speech. It was a boundary the camp could test with its hands. Ari moved fast, but her hands shook. The hook slipped once. Ren started to shout, then stopped himself and used his shoulder to hold the panel steady. I saw the effort it cost him not to blame her. Maybe the storm was teaching him faster than I could. The line sounded ordinary, but ordinary lines were what kept panic contained. The western trench filled first. Water ran along it, hit the bend, and moved away from the shelter instead of under the floor. For one breath, I felt the quiet satisfaction of being right. Then leaves clogged the bend, and the water began climbing the bank. I dropped to my knees and reached into the brown stream. Mud filled my nails. A hidden branch jammed sideways across the narrowest point. Ren shouted that the wall was moving. Ari shouted that the map bag was slipping. The storm finally found three problems at once. That was what real crisis did. It did not attack the strongest point. It made every weak point speak at the same time. I let the pause settle because rushed courage had already cost us too much. I told Ari to save the map first. Knowledge was lighter than panels and harder to rebuild if water ate it. I told Ren to brace the west wall and stop watching me. If the panel twisted free, the trench would not matter. Then I shoved the metal rod into the drain bend and levered the branch loose. The water punched forward so hard it splashed my face. The trench swallowed the stream and carried it downhill. Mud sucked at my knees. My ribs hurt from the pressure of breathing. I wanted to collapse for 1 second. The storm did not give me 1 second, so I stole half a breath and stood. It was one more ugly fact that had to become useful before night arrived. A crash split the air. A tree near the outer signal line bent, cracked, and slammed into the ground beside the south wall. The signal tins screamed as the line snapped. The sound was almost human, then vanished under the rain. The camp listened differently now, not like an audience, but like workers. Ren flinched, but he did not run. He pressed both hands against the wall where the impact had shaken the stones loose. I kept my voice low because low voices traveled better through fear. Ari crawled under the roof edge and pushed a crate against the floor panel to stop water from lifting it. The proof was not beautiful, but beauty had never saved our water. We were no longer three people with separate grudges. For those minutes, we were a bad machine trying not to break apart. The roof seam opened above my shoulder. Rain poured through in a cold line. I shoved folded sailcloth into the gap and tied it with cable. My fingers were too numb to feel the knot. I pulled until the cable cut my palm, then wrapped it around the frame again. Ren saw the blood and said nothing. That silence mattered too. Some men only become useful after they run out of commentary. The night folded around the shelter. Wind turned the walls into drums. Rain turned the ground into moving skin. I marked the thought quickly before exhaustion made it softer than it was. I tracked every sound: roof groan, wall scrape, drain flow, stone shift. A wrong noise could mean failure before the eye saw it. Ari sat beside the map bag, repeating the weak points under her breath like a prayer made from inventory. The decision had to survive without me explaining it twice. Ren crouched near the west wall, soaked through, arms shaking, jaw tight. He looked like a man holding up his own broken image. Another surge of water hit the lower trench. This time it found the path and moved away. The system was ugly, but it was learning. Near midnight, the second water pit collapsed at one edge. The plastic sagged and dirty runoff started sliding toward the container. I moved too late. Ren reached it first. He jammed both hands into the mud and held the edge while I reset the stones around the sagging plastic. He did not ask whether it was important. He had learned that if I moved towards something in a storm, it mattered. Ari passed me clay, then cloth, then cable without being asked twice. Her fear had become sequence. We saved the pit, but lost half the day's collection. I wrote the loss into my head and hated how much it hurt. On the raft, Ren had taken crates. Here, a few mouthfuls of water felt like a murdered future. The storm peaked after midnight. Not louder, heavier. Like the island had stopped throwing punches and started leaning its whole body on us. The shelter sank slightly into the softened ground. I felt the floor tilt under my knees and knew the lower stones were shifting. I told everyone to move toward the rear panel. Wait there might counter the lean until the mud stopped sliding under the lower stones. Ren moved first. Ari followed with the map bag against her chest. I dragged the sealed bottle and food tin with one hand. For an hour we sat pressed against the rear wall like cargo, using our own bodies as ballast against the island. No one spoke. There was nothing to say that Rain would respect. When the wind finally weakened, the silence felt fake. My ears kept inventing sounds because they did not trust peace anymore. Gray light entered through the roof seam. The rain thinned into drops, then threads, then a tired mist. I crawled outside first. The camp looked as if a larger animal had stepped on it and decided not to finish the job. The south signal line was gone. One wall section leaned. The trench had cut a brown scar through the sand. The shelter still stood. The first water pit had survived. The second was damaged but usable. The food tin was dry. The map was dry. The camera still worked. I stood there with rain on my face and felt no triumph. Triumph was too clean a word for mud, blood, and exhaustion. I watched their faces until the rule landed where panic had been. Ren came out behind me. He looked at the wall, the trench, the roof, the water pits, and finally at his own hands. The words mattered only if they changed what someone did next. His palms were swollen and cut from holding mud and stone through the night. He flexed them slowly, as if they belonged to someone else. The man who had called this place garbage had spent the night keeping it alive with his body. He sat on a fallen branch and did not speak. That silence was the loudest surrender he had given me. Ari filmed the camp in slow passes, not for drama, for proof. The wall, the trench, the saved pit, the places where we failed. She stopped at Ren's hands and filmed them too. He noticed, but did not tell her to stop. Maybe he understood that this was the first honest footage of him anyone had ever taken. The hunter returned near midday with two others from his people. They stopped at the edge of the camp and looked at what remained. He touched the trench with his spear, followed its path downhill, then looked at me with the same guarded calculation as before. This time there was something else beneath it. Not praise exactly, more like the beginning of belief. Ren saw that look and lowered his eyes before the hunter could ignore him again. That was another kind of lesson. We spent the afternoon repairing instead of resting. The storm had shown us every lie the camp had told about being ready. Ari marked the failures on the bark map. Not just locations, causes, weak knots, bad slope, shallow trench, exposed line. Ren carried stones to the broken section without being told. He did it slower now, choosing shape instead of size, and the wall accepted the difference. When he placed a flat stone exactly where I would have placed it, I said nothing. He heard the silence and understood it as approval. Late in the afternoon, Ari called from the beach. Her voice cut through the tired camp with a fear I had not heard since the raft. Something had washed ashore beyond the wreck line. Not wood, not fiberglass, a dark rectangular crate with black straps and a stamped mark. I took the camera, the obsidian blade, and the multi-tool. Ren came with me without asking if I needed protection. The camp had learned to respect instructions that could be checked. The crate lay half buried in wet sand. Its corners were reinforced. Its straps were synthetic, the same black material I had found near the first print. My stomach tightened before I touched it. The island was not giving us gifts. It was returning someone else's property to shore. Ari filmed the mark on the side, a broken circle around 3 crossed lines. I had seen it in old news footage before the show hired me. Smugglers used that mark on routes no tourist map admitted existed. Weapons, fuel, stolen medicine, people when profit got uglier. Ren reached for the latch. I slapped his hand away harder than I meant to. He stared at me, but he did not swing back. I did not need them inspired. I needed them alive and moving. I opened it myself from the side, keeping my body out of the direct line of whatever pressure or trap might wait inside. The lid lifted with a wet scrape. Inside were wrapped ammunition boxes, a sealed pistol, 2 medical packs, and a folded coastal chart. Ren stared at the pistol the way he had stared at the shell cup. Different thirst, same danger. The choice stayed rough, but rough choices were all the island offered. I closed the lid before his hand moved again. A weapon in frightened hands becomes a new problem faster than it becomes a solution. He said guns meant we could protect ourselves. I said guns meant the owners had a reason to come looking. The camera saw it plainly, which was all I needed from it then. Ari unfolded the edge of the coastal chart with careful fingers. Salt had blurred some lines, but one bay remained circled in red. The circled bay sat too close to our camp, close enough that a man walking from it could leave prints by our south wall before sunrise. The storm had not only tested our shelter, it had delivered proof that the hunter's warning was already inside our perimeter. I filmed the crate, the mark, the chart, the pistol, Ren's face, and the dark line of trees behind the beach until the warning felt complete. My voice sounded flat when I recorded the next objective. Secure the crate, hide the mark, assume the owners were alive. Ren looked from the crate to the repaired wall and finally understood why the storm had been the smaller enemy. The next breath belonged to action, not explanation. The sky behind us cleared into a pale orange evening. The island smelled washed clean, but the crate made that cleanliness feel false. We had survived wind, water, mud, and the failure of our own rough shelter. We had not survived the men who owned this box. I told Ari to wrap the chart. I told Ren to carry the crate only after I tied the lid shut. I told myself not to look tired. The camp was still standing. The water pit still worked. The wall was higher than before. The system had passed its first trial, but the storm had thrown a new rule at our feet. On this island, surviving nature only made you visible to people who wanted what nature had failed to take. The crate changed the camp more than the storm had. The storm had left broken lines in the sand. The crate left new lines inside our heads. I kept it tied shut until we carried it above the tide mark. Ren held one side, and I held the other with the camera case against my hip. Ari followed with the coastal chart wrapped inside the red waterproof bag. She held it like a sleeping animal that might wake dangerous. The hunter walked behind us without speaking. His spear stayed low, but his eyes moved from the jungle to the beach and back again. No one asked whether the smugglers would come. The only question left was whether we would be ready when they stepped out of the trees. I set the crate inside the camp, not near the shelter and not near the water pits. Weapons did not belong beside thirst or sleep. Ren watched the tied lid as if it might solve every problem by existing. That was why I did not give him the pistol. Nobody had the luxury of understanding slowly anymore. He had begun learning discipline, but learning is not the same as being safe. A frightened strong man with a gun can destroy a small camp faster than enemies. I recorded the contents one by one without opening the packages fully. Ammunition, medical packs, coastal chart, sealed pistol, black straps. Ari copied the mark from the crate onto bark, broken circle, 3 crossed lines. She drew it cleaner than the salt-stained stamp. The hunter touched the mark with the blunt end of his spear and shook his head once. Not surprise, recognition. That reaction mattered. A symbol is only decoration until someone afraid of it proves it has weight. I asked Ari to place every clue on the map. First boot print near the wreck, rope strip, brass casing, south footprint, crate, circled bay. She laid the bark pieces in a row. The island stopped looking like wilderness and started looking like a route someone else had used before us. Ren stared at the map. For once, he did not mock the scratches. He understood enough to see the line running straight toward our camp. The circled bay was south of us. The footprints came from the south. The watcher had stood on the south side. The pattern was not subtle anymore. I turned the camera toward the map and made the next entry. Objective: transform camp from shelter into defended system before owner's return. Ren asked how long we had. I said I did not know. Then I corrected myself. I said not knowing was the reason we had to act as if we had hours. The hunter left before noon and returned with 3 people from his village. 2 carried woven baskets. 1 carried a coil of thick vine. They did not look like soldiers. That was good. Soldiers expect war to look familiar. Survivors understand that war can begin as hunger. I did not ask them to fight. First, I asked them to watch. People who know the land see warnings before people who only own weapons. Ari translated through gesture and map marks. She pointed to the bay, then to the camp, then to the high trees overlooking both. The hunter understood. He placed 2 stones on the bark map, then moved them to the ridge above the south path, where his people could watch unseen. Observation posts, not walls, not traps, eyes. That was the first layer of defense, and it belonged to people who already knew how to disappear. I gave each observer a sound mark using shells and knots, 1 pull for movement, 2 for many people, 3 for danger close enough to touch. It was crude. It was not a radio. It was still faster than shouting after men had already reached the wall. Ren asked where he fit. His voice sounded different, less like a demand, more like a man afraid of the answer. I looked at his shoulders, his hands, the way people moved aside when he carried stone, and the way he waited when I spoke now. You lead the heavy group, I said. Not the camp, not the plan, the heavy group. He frowned at the border I had drawn around his authority. Then his eyes moved to Ari, the hunter, the map, and the crate. He understood that refusing would not make him leader. It would only make him useless in front of people who had stopped needing his performance. I pointed to the open clearing beside the wall. If something broke, his group moved it. If someone fell, his group pulled them back. If I signaled, they struck. Ren asked what counted as a signal. I lifted the camera and showed him the 3 shell lines, the red cloth marker, and the bark map positions. He listened, really listened. That was new enough to make me more careful than proud. The moment passed quickly, but the rules stayed behind.
Real leadership is not about being the strongest body in the camp. Ren wanted authority because he wanted people to look at him. Kama takes authority because the system needs someone who can place every strength where it works. That is why he does not destroy Ren. He turns Ren's strength into a tool with rules, limits, and purpose.
I built the first training drill with no speeches. A dragged log became a wounded person. A pile of stones became a blocked path. Ren's group had to move the log, protect the water pit, and return behind the wall before Ari's signal line rang 3 times. On the first attempt, Ren ran ahead and left 2 people behind. He reached the log fast and failed the drill before touching it. He looked furious when I stopped him. I pointed to the 2 left behind, then to the imaginary enemy route on the map. A strong man arriving alone is not rescue. It is bait with muscles. Ren swallowed the insult because it was not an insult. The map made it a fact, and facts had become harder for him to fight. On the second attempt, he moved slower. He pointed before running. He waited for the others to grip the log. They returned together. It was clumsy, ugly, and almost effective. That made it better than most of his old performances because this time others could repeat it. The hunter watched from the wall, expression unreadable. When Ren finished, the hunter tapped his spear once against the stone. Ren heard it. He stood a little straighter, but not in the old way. This time, pride came from doing the work correctly. Ari marked the drill result on bark. Success was not just what happened. It was what could be repeated by someone else tomorrow. That was the difference between luck and system. Luck saves you once. System teaches the next tired person where to stand. By evening, the camp had roles: watchers, carriers, water keepers, map keeper, heavy group, repair hands. Children stayed near the inner shelter. I did not like how quickly it looked like command. Command attracts obedience, and obedience can become laziness if people stop thinking. So I made every role report failure, not success. If a knot slipped, say it. If a path flooded, mark it. If fear rose, name it before it ruled you. Ren called that depressing. Ari said it was useful. The hunter said nothing, but sent one of his people to mark a weak tree near the south path. The next morning, we moved from defense into knowledge. The camera became the center of the camp without anyone naming it that. Ari spread the bark map in the shade. I replayed old footage, pausing whenever the landscape gave us something we had missed. A bend in the shoreline, a second gap in the trees, a darker patch of soil near the bay, bird movement above the cliffs after the storm. Ari sorted the clips by sector: North Rec, West Beach, South Path, Inner Trees, Circled Bay, unknown low ground beyond the clay bank. Her handwriting was rough, but her system was clear. She was not becoming my assistant. She was becoming the camp's memory. If I died, the island could not take everything I knew with me. I showed the watchers how to frame distance with two fixed branches. If a person crossed from one branch to the other, they were on the lower path. I showed them how to mark time by shadow on a flat stone, not exact time, useful time. Enough to know whether movement was routine or wrong. I did not teach them heroics. I taught them comparison. The island was full of normal. Danger began when normal changed. By midday, we had a rough warning net. Watchers on the ridge, signal shells near the wall, Airy at the map, Wren near the heavy group. It looked too small to stop armed men. It was too small to stop armed men. But it was no longer just a camp waiting to be found. The hunter pointed toward the South Bay near afternoon and touched two fingers to his eyes. He wanted proof, not guesses. I wanted the same thing. The difference was that my eyes came with a lens. Wren insisted on coming. I almost refused. Then I looked at the jungle path, the crate, and the places where I would need a body between me and a blade. I told him he could come as guard, not leader. He nodded before pride could invent a complaint. We left near dusk, when light softened the edges of the trees, but the camp still had enough visibility to watch us go. Ari wanted to come. I told her no. Someone had to keep the map alive if we did not return. She accepted the answer, but not easily. That was good. Useful people should hate being left behind for useful reasons. Wren and I moved through the south path with the hunter ahead of us. The jungle smelled different after the storm, washed clean on top and rotten underneath. Every broken branch felt loud. Every bird call sounded like a warning meant for someone better at listening. The silence around it told me the camp had heard enough. The hunter stopped twice and corrected my foot placement with the end of his spear. He did not make me feel stupid. The jungle did that by itself. At the ridge above the bay, he lowered himself behind a wet log and motioned for us to do the same. I trusted the map more than my nerves and the order more than my anger. I lifted the camera slowly and used the longest lens. The bay opened below us in a narrow curve of black rocks and pale sand. Two boats sat pulled under branches, not fishing canoes, motorboats, painted dark, with cargo nets folded over their sides. Beside them stood men with rifles under rain covers. Not many, but enough. Enough to kill a camp that walked into their line of sight. My throat went dry in a way that had nothing to do with thirst. The storm had not washed them away. It had only hidden them. I counted bodies through the lens. One near the boats, two by the crates, one higher on the path, another sleeping under a tarp. Wren breathed too loudly beside me. I touched his wrist once, and he understood enough to slow it down. That single moment told me more about his progress than any apology. He did not speak. He adjusted. Their leader came from behind the larger boat. Broad shoulders, shaved head, pale scar down one cheek, pistol at his belt. He did not move like Wren. Wren performed space. This man owned it by making everyone else move less. That was the difference between fear and procedure beginning to show. I filmed his face, his route, the guard changes, the crates, the boats, and the path leading from the bay toward our south wall. The camera was not my weapon because it could hurt him. It was my weapon because it could make his route, timing, and habits visible. One guard pointed toward the ridge. My stomach dropped. The hunter flattened lower. Wren's hand closed around a stone. The island had no patience for speeches, and neither did I. The guard squinted into the trees for 3 long breaths. Then another man shouted from the boat, and his attention broke. We did not move until the light dimmed further. Fear told me to run. The map in my head told me running would make sound. We withdrew 1 step at a time. The hunter went first. I followed. Wren waited until I moved, then backed away with his shoulders tight. Halfway down the path, a branch cracked under my heel. It was small. It sounded enormous. A voice rose behind us from the bay, not alarm yet. Question: the kind of sound that can become alarm if answered badly. The hunter grabbed my sleeve and pulled me into a hollow beneath twisted roots. Wren folded himself beside us, too large for silence. 2 smugglers passed above the hollow. Mud dropped from their boots onto leaves near my camera hand. One of them said the storm had thrown the crate inland. The other said the boss would skin anyone who lost it. That answered one question. The crate mattered. It also made our camp a place they would eventually search. When their steps faded, Wren closed his eyes and exhaled through his nose. He looked pale, but he had not broken. I almost told him good work. I stopped. Praise at the wrong time can be another kind of noise. We returned to camp after dark. Irie met us before the wall, camera bag open, map ready, face tense. I handed her the memory card like it weighed more than the crate. In a way, it did. The camp needed a working answer, not a beautiful one. We gathered around the map without fire. Aerie drew the bay by touch and moonlight while I described the boats, guards, leader, and route. Ren added one detail before I did. The second guard limped on his left leg. He had noticed it while hiding under the roots. I looked at him. He looked away. Then he pointed to the lower path and said the limping man would slow a group moving uphill. That was useful, not loud, not heroic. Useful. Aerie marked it. The hunter nodded once. Ren saw both reactions and did not ruin them by speaking again. The plan changed. We would not meet them at the wall first. We would make the path to the wall lie to them before it opened. False trail near the wet ground. Signal line through the narrow trees. Loud shells on the empty route. Quiet watchers on the real route. Ren's heavy group would not charge. They would wait behind the inner curve until the signal cloth dropped. The line became useful only when someone moved because of it. He repeated the instruction back to me, slowly. Exactly. I felt the camp shift again around that simple obedience. I watched the rule enter the camp like another tool being handed around. We needed communication faster than feet. The old cable, the cracked speaker, the small battery, and the solar panel became more important than sleep. I spent the night building a crude line from the shelter to the ridge post. Not a real radio. More like a stubborn wire that could carry sound. Ren held the coil while I stripped cable. Aerie kept the map dry. The hunter watched sparks from the battery with distrust and interest. The first test failed. The second made only a hiss. The third carried Aerie's voice through the cracked speaker in a thin ghost of sound. No one cheered. We were too tired. But every face in the shelter changed when sound crossed distance without shouting through the wire. By dawn, the camp had become something stranger than a shelter. Not an army, not a village, a nervous machine with people for moving parts. I recorded the new objective with the camera balanced on a stone. Do not win by fighting their strength. Win by choosing where their strength becomes useless. Ren listened from the wall. Aerie listened beside the map. The hunter listened from the south path with his spear across his knees. Then the ridge signal line trembled twice. 2 pulls. Many people. Aerie looked at me. Ren stood. The hunter turned toward the jungle before the second shell stopped moving. The smugglers had left the bay. They were walking toward the camp, and the line between warning and battle had already vanished. The ridge signal trembled twice, then twice again. Many people. The message crossed the wire before the smugglers crossed the trees. Aerie looked at me from the map table. Her hand hovered above the southern path, charcoal ready, waiting for my first correction. Ren stood near the heavy group with his jaw locked. He did not ask whether we should charge. That restraint was the first useful thing he gave me. The hunter crouched by the inner wall and touched the ground. He felt vibration before I heard steps, then pointed toward the lower wet path. I lifted the camera and checked the lens. The battery was low, the screen scratched, the strap stiff with salt, but the image still obeyed. I told Aerie to mark the first route as active. I told the watchers to stay hidden. I told Ren to wait until the red cloth dropped. Waiting was the part he hated most. That made it the part I needed from him. The first smugglers appeared between the palms with rifles held low and confidence held high. They expected hunger, confusion, and soft walls. They found a silent camp instead. No smoke, no shouting. No bodies visible near the water pits. Only a narrow path that looked carelessly open. It was not carelessly open. It was the easiest lie I had ever built with mud, footprints, and broken branches. I put it where the others could use it before fear rearranged it. The lead man stepped onto the soft patch without slowing. His boots sank past the ankle, and the hidden mud swallowed his balance. He cursed and reached for a branch. The branch bent under his weight and released a net of vines across his shoulders. The camp had begun to survive through memory, not instinct alone. The net did not kill him. It stole his shape. His rifle dropped first, then his pride, then the neat line of men behind him. Another smuggler rushed forward and hit the low cord. A weighted log swung from the side and knocked his legs out from under him. The sound was ugly, but not final. That mattered. I had not built a graveyard. I had built hesitation. A simple line was easier to carry than a heroic speech. Hesitation spread faster than injury. Men with weapons stopped trusting the ground, the trees, the shadows, and each other. Aerie whispered the first correction through the crude speaker. 2 men breaking right, limping guard behind them, lower branch marker. Her voice came thin through the wire, but it carried. I moved the stone token on the map and touched the shell line beside me. The watchers answered with one pull. Movement, not danger close yet. I could feel the whole camp inside that answer. eyes on the ridge, Airy on the map. Ren waiting behind the inner curve, my hand on the camera. The smugglers fired into the brush, leaves jumped, bark broke. No one screamed because no one was where fear told them to shoot. That was the first rule of the defense. Never stand where an angry man expects a target to stand. I let the camera keep the record while my hands returned to work. Their leader arrived at the back of the first group. The scar on his cheek looked pale through the lens, even under the green shade. He did not shout at the trapped man. He watched the mud, the net, the log, and the empty trees. His face tightened, not with rage, but thought. That was the moment I knew the easy part was over. He raised 2 fingers and split his men without wasting a word. One group pushed toward the false trail. Another moved toward the dry ridge. A stupid enemy breaks against the first wall. A careful enemy looks for the person who built it. I told Airy to shift the map. Dry ridge group active. False trail group delayed. Tell the hunter to close the stone pass. The wire hissed, then carried her reply. Understood. Her voice did not shake this time. Fear had become function. It was not victory yet. It was only the shape of one more chance. The hunter moved before the order fully finished. He and 2 villagers slid through the trees with nets folded under their arms. The dry ridge looked safe because it was higher. That was why I had left it looking safe. Rainwater had loosened the roots under the ridge edge. I had marked the soft line during the storm, then covered it with leaves after dawn. The first smuggler crossed it and felt the ground drop. Not a cliff, not death, just enough collapse to throw him sideways. He rolled into a narrow pocket between rocks, lost his rifle, and spent the next minute fighting vines that had never cared about his rank. The second man tried to help him and stepped into the hunter's net. 2 villagers pulled from opposite sides and the net folded him to the ground. Again, not dead. Stopped, disarmed, loud. Noise mattered more than blood. Every shout told the others their map of the island was wrong. The leader heard it too. Through the lens, I saw him stop, lower his head, and look at the trees above the ridge instead of the path below. He was not hunting the camp anymore. He was hunting the system. I marked him with the camera. Scar Leader Moving Center. Watching high, adapting, Airy repeated it through the wire. Ren heard the words near the heavy group and turned his head toward me. I did not look at him. If I looked, he might think the order had arrived. It had not. The leader cut the first signal line with 1 shot. The shells fell silent on the south branch, and the map lost one of its ears. Airy's face went pale, but her hand moved. She marked the cut line with a black slash and shifted the nearest watcher to a backup point. Good, I thought. Do not mourn the line. Replace the function. The smugglers began using broken crate lids as shields against hanging nets. They moved slower, but they moved smarter. One man found a vine loop before stepping into it and sliced it apart with a short blade. Another kicked mud over the low cord to expose it. The field I had built was no longer hidden. It had become a conversation, and the enemy had started answering with blades, shields, and patience. I changed the plan before pride could protect the old one. Pull back outer watchers, leave the false route noisy, open the narrow pass. Airy repeated the orders. The hunter responded with 3 short shell pulls from the inner tree. Danger close enough to touch. Ren took 1 step forward. I lifted my hand without looking at him. He stopped. I needed him angry. I did not need him early. The leader pushed through the center with 4 men. They avoided the mud, ignored the empty shells, and moved toward the wall from the blind angle. They had found the weak idea under the strong branches. If they reached the inner gap before Ren moved, they would split the camp in half. I dropped the red cloth marker. Ren moved like a thrown stone, not ahead of his group this time, with them. I watched Ren hear it without turning it into another performance. His first man carried a shield made from a hull panel. His second dragged a net. Ren himself held a thick branch wrapped with wet cloth. They came from the inner curve exactly where the smugglers did not look, because Ren had finally learned the value of not being seen first. The hull shield hit the lead smuggler's rifle and drove it sideways. The net caught the second man's arms before he could aim. Ren struck the third man in the shoulder, not the head. Hard enough to drop him, controlled enough to keep the plan from becoming slaughter. That control was new. That control was mine, his, and the island's, all at once. Airy wrote it down before anyone could pretend it had not been said. The heavy group closed around the gap. Stones moved, panels shifted. A path that had existed a breath earlier became a wall of bodies and scrap. For the first time, Ren's strength did not demand the center of the story. It became a hinge, and the whole defense turned around it. The villagers pulled the disarmed men back with vines. Airy marked captures with small stones on the bark map, 1 by 1. I did not let myself count victory yet. The leader was still moving. He had not joined the trapped men. He had used them to find the response time of the heavy group. Now he slipped away from the center while everyone looked at Ren. I saw him through the camera a second before he vanished behind the low palms. Scar leader leaving center, moving east, searching for command. Airy heard my voice through the wire and looked up from the map. East meant the command shelter. East meant me. The hunter gave no praise, which made the silence easier to trust. Ren saw her expression and turned too late. He started to move, but 3 smugglers surged toward his group again, forcing him back into the gap. Good enemies create more than one emergency. This one had learned that faster than I liked. I grabbed the camera, the bark map roll, and the cracked speaker. The command shelter suddenly felt too small around me. I did not run. Running would shake the lens, break the wire, and make sound. I moved along the rear trench, low and slow. The leader came through the east brush without warning. He had a pistol in one hand and a knife in the other, but his eyes went first to the map. That made him dangerous. He understood what mattered before he understood who I was. He stepped into the shelter and saw no chief, no warrior, no pile of weapons. Just wet bark, shell cords, a cracked speaker, and me. For half a second, disappointment crossed his face. Then the disappointment changed into something better and more dangerous: recognition. He looked at the camera in my hand, then at the tokens on the map, then at the wire running toward the ridge. The prisoners heard it too, and that was part of the point. The pistol lifted slowly. His smile was small and ugly, not because he thought I was weak, but because he finally understood where to shoot. He said something I did not understand. I understood the tone. Every language has a sound for contempt discovering intelligence. I kept the camera pointed at him. My hand shook, but the frame held his face, pistol, scar, and the map behind him. A place becomes real when its rules outlive the first fear that made them. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was the only thing I knew how to do when death stood close enough to breathe on the lens. He stepped closer and kicked the speaker aside. The wire snapped. The camp lost my voice. Outside, the battle continued without knowing the head of its system had been cut off. The leader raised the pistol toward my chest. Then he heard a shell line move behind him. Not from the ridge, not from the wall, from the roof of the shelter, where Airy had tied one backup cord I had almost forgotten. The sound was tiny, one dry click. It was enough to make his eyes move. Ren hit him from the side before he could look back fully. The impact drove both men into the shelter post. The pistol fired into the roof and filled the air with splinters and white dust. I threw myself over the map. Not brave, practical. If the map died, more people might follow it. I let the map decide the next step before pride could volunteer. Ren and the leader rolled in the mud. The leader was faster than I expected and cut Ren across the arm before Ren pinned his wrist. I grabbed the broken speaker and smashed it against the leader's hand. The pistol dropped into the mud beside the water jar. The leader stared at me then. Really stared. Not at Ren, not at the wall, at me. He saw the camera, the map, the shell lines, the tokens, the scratch marks, and the man he had nearly dismissed as a frightened clerk. His face changed the way Ren's had changed at the water cup, a whole false idea collapsing in public. He had brought rifles, boats, and men. I had brought footage, mud, rules, and people who knew where to stand.
This is the moment the story proves its main idea. Keima does not beat the stronger enemy by becoming stronger in the usual way. He wins because every observation became a rule, every rule became a role, and every role became a wall. The camera was never a toy. It was the brain of a system that turned chaos into terrain.
Ren twisted the leader's arm behind his back and forced him down. This time, he did not look at Airy or the camera for approval. He looked at me and asked where to put him. That question mattered more than any apology he had ever failed to make. I pointed to the inner post. Tie him. Take his weapon. Do not let anyone strike him unless he moves. Ren obeyed. The word still felt strange beside his name, but there it was, working inside the camp like another repaired tool. When the leader fell, the remaining smugglers lost the shape of their attack. Some kept fighting, some ran, most looked toward the missing command and hesitated. Hesitation had been my first trap, and now it returned at the center of them, breaking orders before our nets reached them. The hunter's people moved through the trees with nets and cords. Ren's heavy group pushed from the wall. Airy shouted positions from the recovered map. I used hand signals now, because the speaker was dead. A broken system did not mean no system. It meant fewer parts had to work harder. One by one, the smugglers dropped weapons, slipped in mud, or backed into nets they had thought already exposed. I kept counting because numbers were less likely to flatter me. The last group tried to retreat toward the bay, but the hunter had closed the stone pass with his people before they reached it. By late afternoon, the island grew quiet except for breathing, groans, and the slow drip of water from leaves onto broken shields. The battle did not end with a cheer. It ended with people looking around to learn who had not stood back up yet. Nothing about it felt heroic, which was usually a sign it might work. That was the part shows never filmed correctly. Victory has inventory, wounded, lost tools, broken lines, captured weapons, people shaking after the danger ends. Airy kept filming. Not faces for drama, hands tying bandages, mud on knees, Ren carrying a wounded villager, the hunter checking every prisoner. I told her to record the weapons and the crate mark too. If more men came later, memory would need proof, not just fear. Ren carried the bound leader to the inner post and tied him there with 3 knots instead of 1. He had learned what weak knots cost. The leader spat at the ground, then looked at the camera again. He understood it now, and I think he hated it more than the ropes. I checked the pistol first, then unloaded it with shaking hands. A weapon without rules was just another storm waiting for a careless grip. Ren watched me place it back in the crate. He did not reach for it. That was another quiet victory. The camp had enough pain. It needed sequence. The hunter brought the captured rifles one by one and laid them on the ground between us, not as gifts, as problems needing rules. We had beaten armed men with mud, maps, nets, patience, and just enough force at the right second. That sentence sounded impossible even inside my own head, so I let the camera keep the proof. Ari found me beside the broken speaker near sunset. Her face was streaked with mud, and her hands were black from charcoal and blood. She said the map was damaged but readable. The south line was gone. The ridge line could be repaired. The prisoners were counted. I asked how many of us were hurt. She told me. The number stayed in my chest like a stone. No one from our side had died, but that did not make the wounds light. Survival is not clean just because it is successful. Ren approached after her, carrying a torn strip of sailcloth wrapped around his arm. The cut was shallow but bleeding through. He stopped in front of me and looked at the camera, then at the map, then at the prisoners by the wall. For once, no performance came to rescue him. He said thank you. The words were awkward, almost too small for the mud and smoke around us, but they were real enough to stand on their own. I nodded because I did not know what else to do with them. Some resources arrived too late to spend immediately. I saved the anger for later and spent the breath on instruction. The hunter came next and touched the broken circle mark on the crate, then pointed at the prisoners with a hard question in his eyes. His people wanted punishment. I could see it in their hands, in the way they held cords, in the way they watched the bound men. Ren looked ready to agree with them. Ari looked ready to record whatever I chose and make it part of the island's memory. That was the danger after victory. Everyone wants the next rule to feel like revenge. I looked at the prisoners, the weapons, the broken wall, the wounded, and the camp that had almost become a battlefield grave. We had survived because we became a system. If the first thing the system did after winning was become hunger with ropes, it would rot. I told them no one would be killed in anger. The silence after that was sharper than any shell line. The idea was small, but small ideas were easier to defend. I said the prisoners would be bound, watched, questioned, and made to work. Walls, trenches, repairs, clearing paths, carrying what they came to steal. Ren stared at me like I had chosen difficulty on purpose. Maybe I had. Easy choices had almost killed us many times. The hunter did not agree immediately. His face tightened around old pain I did not know how to measure. I did not push him. People who have been hurt by raiders do not owe forgiveness because a stranger with a camera prefers order. I only pointed to the broken wall, then to the prisoners, then to the wounded people who needed a safer camp before night. Ari lowered the camera slightly. She understood what I was doing before Ren did. The enemies who came to take our camp would help rebuild it. Not because they deserved mercy, because the living needed stronger walls. Ren finally exhaled and looked toward the leader tied to the post. The old Ren might have wanted punishment with an audience. The new Ren, or at least the version the island was carving out of him, looked at the broken wall and saw labor. He picked up a coil of vine and stood beside the prisoners without speaking, guarding, not posing. I recorded the last entry of the day with the camera balanced on a cracked crate. Battle survived. Leader captured. Weapons secured. Rules unresolved. My voice almost broke on the final word. I kept it flat. The report needed steadiness, even when I had none left. The line was not perfect. It only had to hold until the next one. The camp around me moved slowly back into order. Bandages, water ration, prisoner knots, weapon count, wall damage, map repair. That was how the War of the Operator ended. Not with a throne. Not with a cheer. With a list of things that still had to be fixed. Above the trees, the sky burned orange behind the storm clouds. The island looked peaceful again, which felt like another kind of lie. I turned off the camera only after Ari had copied the final marks onto bark. For the first time since Ren pushed me from the raft, the camp was not waiting to survive the next threat. It was deciding what kind of place it would become after surviving, and that decision had to be simple enough for tired hands to follow. Morning did not make the camp safer. It only made every broken thing visible enough to judge without mercy, and the prisoners were already awake. The prisoners sat beside the inner wall with their wrists tied in vine and cable. Their weapons lay unloaded in a sealed crate behind me. The hunters' people stood across from them, silent and hard-eyed. Some held spears, some held stones. None looked ready to forgive. Ren stood near the prisoners with a coil of vine over one shoulder. He had placed himself between them and the crowd without being told. That mattered. Yesterday, he would have stood where the camera could see him. Today, he stood where trouble might begin without being called. Ari kept the camera low but running. She no longer filmed like a person looking for a scene. She filmed like a person preserving evidence. I looked at the broken wall, the damaged trench, the torn nets, and the faces waiting for my decision. Victory had left us with inventory. Prisoners, weapons, wounds, fear, anger, hunger, labor. Every item needed a place before it became poison, so I counted them like supplies. The hunter pointed at the bound leader, then dragged his thumb across his own throat. He did not do it dramatically. That made it worse. I understood the gesture without translation. The smugglers had taken from his people before, maybe worse than taken. The island remembered them in bodies. Ren's eyes moved from the hunter to me. He was waiting to see whether I would choose strength the old way. I held the silence just long enough to turn it into an order. The old way was easy. Break the raiders, call it justice, let fear cheer because fear always loves a clean ending. I did not trust it, but easy endings are often traps with better lighting. Dead prisoners could not rebuild walls, clear paths, dig trenches, or answer questions. I raised both hands and waited until the camp quieted. Silence took longer than it had during the battle. Plain lines were the ones tired people could hold. I said no one would be killed in anger. The words crossed the camp slowly, touching every person in a different wound. I let the pause land because rushed courage had already cost too much. The hunter's jaw tightened. One of his people spat into the sand. Ren looked at the prisoners, then at the broken wall, and said nothing. I did not ask them to forgive. Forgiveness was too expensive to demand from people who had paid in fear for years. Another ugly fact had to become useful before night took over. I pointed to the wall, the trenches, the collapsed signal line, and the piles of wet debris the storm and battle had left behind. I said the prisoners had come to take our labor, water, tools, and lives. Now their labor would rebuild what they had tried to steal. Ari repeated the idea with gestures and drawings on bark. Bound hands became working hands, broken wall became higher wall. The hunter watched her drawing longer than he watched me. A rule that only lived in my mouth was too weak to hold the camp together. The bound leader laughed through a split lip. He said something sharp in his language, and two prisoners smiled like the old world had not ended. Ren stepped toward him, but stopped after one pace. His fists closed, then opened. He looked at me for the rule before his anger became action. That was another repair, not of the wall. Of the man who had once thought every problem existed so he could perform over it. I told Ren to take 3 guards and keep the prisoners separate while they worked. No weapons near them, no revenge games, no private punishment. He nodded once and repeated the orders back to me. Exact words, clear limits. The camp heard him obey rules instead of inventing them. The hunter still did not agree, but he looked at the broken wall, then at the wounded villager sitting beside the water pit. Need does not erase pain. Sometimes it only puts pain to work because the living cannot afford perfect justice before shelter. By midday, the prisoners were digging under guard, vines around wrists, heavy work, water after each task, food only after measured progress. It was the same rule I had given Ren: work first, water after. The island did not care whether the hands were guilty or proud. Ren supervised the first trench team. He corrected one prisoner's grip on the digging plate without shouting, then seemed surprised by himself. The prisoner hesitated, expecting a blow. Ren only pointed to the soil angle and made him try again. Ari filmed that too. Ren saw the lens, but did not straighten his shoulders or search for a heroic angle. That may have been the strangest sight of the day. A man who once lived for performance doing useful work while refusing to pose. I assigned the leader no shovel. Not yet. A man who understands commands can sabotage more with one glance than others can with their hands. He was tied to the inner post and made to watch his own men rebuild the wall they had failed to break. The camp listened like labor now, not like an audience. His face stayed hard, but his eyes moved. He counted guards, measured knots, studied Ren, studied Airy, studied the water pits. That made him dangerous, even tied. I told Airy to mark every moment his eyes returned to the same place. She did not ask why. She marked the water pits twice, the weapon crate once, and the south path 3 times. By afternoon, the camp had a different sound, not the panic of repair after battle, not the rush of storm work, something steadier, stone on stone, clay pressed into gaps, shell lines retied, wounded people giving instructions because standing was not the only way to work. The hunters' people brought woven baskets of clay and roots. Our people brought panels and cable from the wreck. The prisoners brought weight. I began drawing the new camp on bark, not the camp we had, the camp that might survive if I did not wake up tomorrow. I kept my voice low. Low voices traveled better through fear. That thought stayed with me. A place that only works while one person is awake is not a place. It is an emergency with walls. I divided the map into zones: water, food, storage, tools, medical packs, prisoner work, watch posts, clay bank, wreck path, future dock. Ari copied the zones onto a cleaner bark sheet. Her version was easier to read, which meant mine had already done its job. She added small symbols for who knew each task, not who owned it. Who could teach it if the first person was gone? It was ugly proof, but the island had never rewarded beauty. That was when I realized she had understood the real rule before I said it. Survival had to become repeatable, or it was only luck with scars. Ren approached carrying 2 flat stones under one arm. He waited until I looked up before speaking. Another new habit. I caught the thought before exhaustion softened it. He said the prisoners could clear the path to the beach if 2 guards stood behind them and 1 watcher stayed in the trees. I asked why the trees mattered. He pointed toward the blind angle near the old south footprint and said a runner would choose that shadow. He was right. The old Wren would have said it loudly until someone praised him. This Wren waited for the plan to accept the fact. I added the watcher mark and told him to set it up. He left without asking if everyone had heard that the idea had been his. The camp kept changing around us. A wall became a perimeter. A pit became a water station. A pile of wreckage became a tool yard. The red bag became the archive bag. The crate became the weapons store. The prisoners became labor under rules. The map became common memory. None of it looked beautiful. Good systems rarely do at first. They look like tired people tying ugly knots in the right places. Near sunset, Ari asked if she could record a proper account of what had happened since the wreck. The decision had to live without me repeating it. I almost said we did not have time. Then I looked at the prisoners, the weapons, the map, and the children watching from the hunters' people. History is not a luxury after violence. It is another wall. If no one records the truth, the loudest liar rebuilds the world in his shape. I told her to record everything. Not just the battle, the raft, the water pits, the poison berries, the first rule, the storm, the prisoners. She nodded, then looked toward Ren. He was helping 2 villagers lift a panel into place, his bandaged arm shaking under the strain. She asked whether she should record him too. I said yes, but not as punishment. As truth, because the camp needed facts more than comfort. Ren heard his name and turned. For a moment, I saw the old reflex rise, chin higher, shoulders squared, face prepared for the lens. Then he looked at the wall, the prisoners, his own bandaged arm, and the camera in Ari's hands. The pose died before it reached his face. Ari stood a few steps away and asked him what happened after the yacht broke. Ren stared at the ground. The whole camp seemed to keep working slower around him, as if every hammer and stone wanted to hear. He said he took the raft. His voice came out rough, not from thirst this time, from the effort of not dressing the truth in better clothes. He said he pushed me back because he thought I was useless. Then he said the last word again, quieter, like it had finally turned toward him. Ari did not interrupt. The camera stayed steady. The island gave him no music, no heroic light, no editor to cut around the worst part. He said I built the water system. I found the food. I made the map. I warned them about the tide. I stopped the smugglers. He stopped there, breathing through his nose. His hands closed around nothing. Then he added the part I had not expected. He said the camera had not made me weak. It had made me the first person on the island who could prove what was real on this shore. The words moved through me in a way I did not know how to use. I had wanted him exposed. I had not prepared for him to be accurate. The bound leader spat again, but no one looked at him. That might have been the first punishment that truly reached him. Ren looked into the lens and said he had been a fake survival expert. The sentence did not sound dramatic. It sounded like a door closing. Ari lowered the camera only after the silence settled. Her eyes were wet, but her hands stayed steady. I watched until the rule settled where panic had been. She had spent years helping build his image. Now she had filmed him breaking it by choice. That was not revenge. It was a record. I told Ren to get his arm checked before the wound opened again. He nodded and walked to the medical shade without arguing. The hunter watched him go, then looked at me. I could not read his expression, but he no longer looked at Ren like a noisy animal. Maybe usefulness had begun doing what apology alone could not. That night, the camp ate in shifts. Guards first, wounded second, workers third, prisoners last, watched and counted. No one liked every rule. That was fine. Rules built only to be liked break as soon as hunger votes against them. Only changed behavior gave the words any weight. I recorded the ration list, the wall plan, the prisoner count, and the new zones under the title Settlement Draft. For now, that was enough. Anything louder would have become noise. The word settlement felt too large for our wet scraps and mud walls. I said it anyway because people build differently when a place has a future. Ari sat beside me and copied the title onto bark. Her handwriting made it look more official than mine deserved. The camp had started trusting instructions that left visible results. Ren sat near the guard post with the hunter's people. He did not join the center fire. He did not try to reclaim the story. He watched the prisoners, corrected a knot, and passed water to a wounded villager before taking any for himself. Inspiration could come later. Inspiration could wait. Living bodies could not. I filmed that too, not because it erased the raft, because change that is not recorded can be mistaken later for something that always existed. Near midnight, the bound leader tried to speak to two prisoners in a low voice. Ari heard the pattern first and tapped the map board twice. Ren moved before I did, not violently. He separated the prisoners, tightened the knots, and placed one of the hunter's people between them. Then he reported it to me instead of turning it into a performance. Progress, I was learning, sometimes looks like a man doing the boring part right. The leader's eyes found the water pits again. I added another guard to that side and moved the sealed weapon crate farther from the center. Every rule created another rule. That was exhausting, but still better than chaos pretending to be freedom. The choice remained rough, but the island rarely offered clean ones. Before dawn, I walked the perimeter alone with the camera. New trenches, higher wall, prisoner line, watch tree, clay store, archive bag. The camp was not pretty, but neither was a spine. It only had to hold. At the eastern edge, where the beach curved toward the wreck, I noticed marks in the sand that the tide had not erased. Not footprints, drag lines, parallel, shallow, and long. Something had been pulled above the waterline before dawn, so I filmed the marks twice. My first thought was smugglers. Then I saw the line of small shells arranged in a pattern near the drag marks. The hunter found me there and touched the shells. His face changed. Not fear this time. Surprise. Ari came with the map bag, still half asleep. Ren followed with two guards, already alert before anyone praised him for it. The hunter pointed toward the horizon. At first I saw only pale morning water and the silver line where sky met sea. Then the sun rose a little higher, and a dark shape appeared beyond the reef. A ship. Not a smuggler boat. Too tall. Not wreckage. Too steady. Its sail caught the first light like a piece of bone held against the sky. People gathered behind us without being called. Children, wounded, guards, prisoners craning their necks from the work line. Ren whispered that it could be rescue. Ari whispered that it could be another threat. Both were right, which made neither useful enough. I lifted the camera and zoomed as far as the lens allowed. The flag above the mast was blurred by distance and morning haze. I could not read it. That meant the camp had one more decision to make before breakfast. Run toward the ship like victims, hide from it like fugitives, or stand where we were and choose how the outside world would find us. I turned the camera toward the settlement draft, then back toward the ship. The lens moved from the place we had built to the world approaching it. My voice stayed steady when I recorded the next line. Unknown vessel on eastern horizon. Camp stable. Prisoners secured. Contact possible. Then I added the part that mattered most. We are no longer waiting to be saved. The ship grew larger beyond the reef, and everyone looked at me again. I hated that look. I needed it too, because after surviving the island, the storm, Ren and the smugglers, our next enemy might be expectation. People outside would want a simple story. Survivors, victims, heroes, criminals, natives, strangers, rescue. I looked at the water pits, the wall, the map, the archive bag, the prisoners, the hunter, Ari, and Ren standing at the guard line. None of us were simple anymore. The camp had become a settlement before we had the courage to call it one. Now the horizon had come to test the name. The ship held its distance beyond the reef for almost an hour. That told me more than its flag, because careful vessels fear careful shores. Nobody moved toward the water until I gave the order. That alone proved how far the camp had traveled from panic, but we watched first. A week ago, if a sail appeared, we would have screamed, waved, begged, and called it salvation before knowing whose hands held the rope. Now Ren kept guards near the prisoners. Irie wrapped the archive bag tighter. The hunter watched the reef like it had spoken in a language he disliked. I raised the camera and zoomed until the ship blurred into wood, cloth, and motion. It was too tall for smugglers and too cautious for rescuers. I could see patched sails, a broad cargo deck, and men leaning over the rail with the same uncertainty we held on the shore. Their flag finally turned in the wind. Not the smuggler mark. Not any emergency service I recognized. A trading emblem, maybe. Maybe was not enough to open the wall. I told Ren to keep the prisoner line behind the inner posts. No one from the ship needed to see panic tied with vines before they saw order. He nodded and moved before I finished. His guards followed him now without looking at me first, and that was both useful and dangerous. Useful because the system was spreading. Dangerous because any system that grows around one person can become another throne if left unwatched. Ari asked whether to record the first contact. I told her to record from behind the water station, away from their faces. We would not look like victims. We would not look like raiders. We would look like a place with rules. There was no room between the breath and the work. The ship lowered a small boat after another long pause. 4 men rowed through the reef channel while one older man stood in the stern. He did not carry a rifle. That mattered. He carried a ledger wrapped in oilcloth and a knife at his belt. Also useful information. A man who brings a ledger to an unknown shore expects trade before war, but keeps a knife because expectation is not trust. The boat scraped the shallows. The older man stepped into the water, looked at the wall, the trenches, the guard line, and then at me. He expected wreck survivors. Instead, he found a settlement with wet clay drying on racks and armed prisoners digging under guard. His eyes did not widen much. That made me respect him more. Men who hide surprise can be negotiated with. Pressure would decide whether the idea deserved to survive. He introduced himself as Captain Orlan of the coastal trader Grey Moth. His accent dragged the words, but the meaning survived. I gave my name and not my story. A name was enough for the first exchange. Stories are expensive when strangers can spend them against you. Orlan asked if we needed rescue. The question moved through the people behind me like wind through loose shells. Nobody had room left to learn slowly. Ren looked toward me, not because he wanted permission to speak, but because he understood the weight of the word rescue. Ari kept the camera steady. The hunter watched Orlan's hands. The prisoners watched the ship like it might become a door. I said we needed contact, trade, and information, not rescue. The word left my mouth cleanly, even though part of me still wanted it. Orlan looked past me at the wall again. He saw the water pits, the clay jars, the drying fish, the guarded weapons crate, and the map table. Then he said people who do not need rescue usually ask for better prices. I almost smiled. Almost. The trade had begun before either of us trusted the other. That was the first sign we could speak the same language. Not because we trusted each other, but because both of us understood exchange. I showed him water first. Clean water in clay cups, stored away from the prisoners and rationed by Mark. His crewmen tasted it carefully. Then I showed him dried fish, clay bowls, rope bundles from vine, usable scrap panels, and the coastal chart taken from the smugglers. At the chart, Orlan's face changed. Not fear exactly. Recognition, then calculation, then the controlled anger of a man who had lost cargo before. He knew the broken circle mark. He called the smugglers reef dogs and said 3 ports had paid quietly to ignore them. That told me the outside world had rules too, and some of them were worse than jungle paths. Ari filmed his answer from the side. Orlan noticed the lens and stopped. For a moment, the whole negotiation tightened. I told him the camera had saved more lives here than any weapon in that crate. If he lied, it would remember. If he told the truth, it would remember that too. Orlan looked at Ari, then back at me. After a long breath, he nodded as if accepting another witness at the table, not just a camera. That was when I knew the camera had become more than my second eye. It had become the settlement's witness, a shared record beyond my hands. We traded carefully, water and dried fish for salt, cloth, extra needles, lamp oil, and news of the nearest lawful port. Orlan offered passage for anyone who wanted to leave. He said it gently, but the words struck harder than I expected. The quiet around that line proved the camp had understood. For days, survival had been the only vote. Now choice had returned, and choice is heavier than hunger when people have forgotten how to carry it. We gathered everyone at the center before sunset. Prisoners remained guarded. The hunters' people stood with ours now, not across from us. I told them the ship could take people away. No shame, no debt, no speeches. Anyone who wanted the mainland could go. I trusted the map more than nerves and the order more than anger. The silence after that felt different from fear. It was the sound of people measuring the shape of their own lives. That was where fear began turning into procedure. The first to step forward was a young deckhand from Wren's crew who had barely spoken since the wreck. He wanted his mother to know he was alive. Two injured villagers chose to send messages, but not leave. One prisoner begged to go, and Wren told him work came before mercy. I corrected Wren in front of everyone. Work came before freedom here, not before mercy. Those were not the same thing, and he heard it. He absorbed the correction without flinching. The old Wren would have turned it into a fight. This one changed the sentence and repeated it properly. Ari watched that moment closely. She had begun filming not just events, but the exact places where people became different. By nightfall, only a few chose the ship. More chose to stay than I expected. The choice frightened me more than the battle had. If people stay because they cannot leave, you run a camp. If they stay because they can leave and choose not to, you are building something heavier. The hunter stood beside the clay jars and touched his chest, then the ground. I did not understand the words, but the decision did not need translation. His people were not joining my settlement. That would be the wrong story. Our settlement and his village were agreeing to survive beside each other. That distinction mattered. Unity forced too quickly becomes another kind of taking. The island punished speeches faster than mistakes, and I had learned that. Orlin returned the next morning with tools, cloth, salt, and 3 small books wrapped against water. He said books made better walls than men expected. I did not know whether he meant it as wisdom or merchant charm. I took the books anyway. Ari opened one carefully and found blank pages. Her face changed as if someone had handed her a second island. She said the archive could finally stop living only on bark and memory cards. Her voice shook more over blank paper than it had over gunfire. I gave her the first book, not as a gift, as a responsibility. The settlement's memory needed a keeper who understood both guilt and truth. She wrote the date by sunrise, then stopped and asked what to call the place. Everyone looked at me again. I hated that look less this time, but only because I knew where to put it. I said the name should not come from me alone. A place named by one person belongs too easily to one person's hunger, so we left the first page with only a working title, The Island That No Longer Waited. Wren laughed once when he heard it, not mockingly. More like the sound hurt and helped at the same time. The working title stayed. Later I found him near the guard post teaching 2 younger men how to check knots without cutting circulation from a prisoner's wrists. He explained it badly at first, then corrected himself. He was still Wren. Transformation had not made him graceful. It had made him useful, but he stayed. He became captain of the guard because people needed his strength, not because he demanded their eyes. A line only became real when bodies moved because of it. Sometimes I saw the old hunger return when the camera passed him. Then he looked at the wall, adjusted a post, and let the hunger die unfed. That was enough. Not sainthood, not redemption painted gold. Enough useful choices stacked in the right direction. I watched that rule move through the camp like a tool passed from hand to hand. The prisoners worked in rotating groups under watch. The leader remained separated, questioned, and recorded whenever Orlan's crew identified another route or name. He hated the camera most of all. Ropes held his body. The lens held his story where he could not reshape it, and that scared him more than knots. Within 3 days, the dock frame rose from wrecked timber and straightened panels. It was ugly, uneven, and strong enough for Orlan's boat. The water station gained clay lids. The tool yard gained labels. The map table moved under a proper roof. The archive bag became an archive shelf. Small things changed the feeling of the place. A cup returned to the same hook. A tool signed out and back. A path cleared before mud swallowed it. Survival had been movement. Settlement was repetition that did not collapse when the person who invented it slept. That was the harder skill. On the 4th morning, Orlan prepared to leave with the few who had chosen the mainland and with sealed messages from nearly everyone else. He asked me once more if I wanted passage. He did not pressure me. That made the question harder. I set it where other people could use it before fear rearranged the scene. I looked at the ship, then at the water pits, the dock, the archive shelf, the wall, the hunter's path, and Aray writing under the roof. I looked at Wren correcting a guard's stance without noticing anyone might be watching. I looked at the camera case by my feet. No, I said. Not because I had no home elsewhere, Because this place still needed someone to finish making it able to survive without me. Orlin nodded like a man who understood unfinished work better than speeches. He promised to return with iron tools, more paper, and lawful witnesses. That last phrase mattered. Lawful witnesses meant the smugglers could not simply become a rumor swallowed by trade routes. Airy recorded Orlan's promise. He did not object this time. He even repeated his name clearly for the camera. When the ship left, the people on board waved. The people on shore waved back, but no one ran after them. That was the moment I believed the settlement might be real, not because a ship had found us, because it could leave, and we did not fall apart. That evening, I took the old camera to the room we had built from the first roof panel I dragged from the wreck. The camp was beginning to remember through systems instead of instinct. The panel still showed scratches from the rocks. I kept them visible. Clean walls lie when they forget what held them up. I sat alone and played the first recording, my face on the beach, salt on my skin, voice shaking while pretending to report. Then the water pit, the first wall, Ren drinking from the shell cup, Airy marking the map, the hunter tasting clean water, storm, mud, nets, gunfire. The leader's face when he saw the map. Ren saying thank you, Airy filming his confession. A plain line could travel farther than a heroic speech. The camera had watched me survive before anyone believed I could. Then it watched the camp become something I could not have built alone. I cleaned the lens with the old cloth from the waterproof case. It was stained, frayed, and still softer than my hands were. For a moment, I thought about keeping the camera on my belt forever. A second eye is hard to put down after darkness has taught you its value. But if the settlement depended on my eye alone, then I had failed the lesson I kept teaching everyone else. I placed the camera inside a wooden box Airy had lined with dry cloth and clay powder to fight the damp. I did not bury it. I did not retire it. I placed it where people could bring it out when memory needed proof. Airy had written the first archive label in the blank book. Camera, first witness. I touched the words and felt something in my chest loosen. Not happiness exactly. Something quieter, more durable. I left the record to the camera while my hands returned to work. Outside, Ren called for the evening guard change. His voice carried across the settlement without asking to become a performance. The hunter's people answered from the south path with 2 shell notes. Routine movement. No danger close. It was not victory yet. It was not victory, only a narrow shape of another chance. Airy sat under the archive roof, writing while a child watched each mark appear like a small construction miracle. I let them work. The prisoners dug the eastern trench under guard. The water station dripped slowly into covered clay jars. Orland's ship was a speck near the horizon. I picked up the new map instead of the camera. It showed the wreck, the bay, the clay bank, the village path, the dock, and future fields. There were blank spaces everywhere. For once, they did not feel like threats. They felt like work. I saw Ren hear it and leave the performance dead. I stepped outside with the map in my hands. People looked up, not like an audience, not like victims, but like workers waiting for the next task. I told them the western slope needed terraces before the next rains. The dock needed another brace. The archive needed copies. Ren asked which group I wanted first. Airy asked which task needed recording. The hunter pointed toward the path where his people could bring stone. The answers came faster than my orders. That was the best sign of all. A system had stopped being mine when other people began improving it before I finished speaking. I looked once toward the sea. The raft was gone. The show was gone. The man Ren had thrown away was gone too. What remained was not a hero. Heroes are too heavy for real work. What remained was an operator who had learned to stop filming someone else's legend and start building a place where legends were unnecessary. The sun dropped behind the trees, turning the clay jars gold and the wreck panels red. The settlement kept moving without waiting for the light to praise it. I opened the map, marked the western slope, and walked toward the people who had chosen to stay. I was no longer waiting to be saved. I was building something that could save itself.
And this is what makes Keima's journey so satisfying. Ren took the raft, the food, the confidence, and the camera-ready smile. Keima got thrown away with the one thing everyone laughed at, his camera. But that useless camera became the reason the island stopped being a death trap. It caught the tide before it drowned him. It found the wreck before the sea took it back. It exposed Ren's fake instincts, mapped the smugglers' routes, and turned a pile of broken yacht parts into a real settlement. That is the best kind of revenge. No screaming, no dramatic speech, just results so clear that even the fake survival expert had to shut up and carry stones for water. If you enjoyed this recap, hit the like button, subscribe, and write in the comments. Would you follow Kima's system, or would you still trust Ren's survival advice?